Thank you, Maggie. I love that little picture of Enid. I can just imagine her being quite feisty. Next up is Michael Mahoney. He will be sharing Exploring the Impact of Equine Facilitated Learning on Military Veterans. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks, y'all, for being here. I'm here to talk about horses. And I'd like to start off with a little thought experiment. Think of a time when you felt a connection with the full self of another being, and it made you feel more fully yourself. Interpret this in the way you will. Just like think about a time when you had like a really deep, meaningful connection with another being, and it made you feel a little bit more fully who you were. Take a moment to think about it. I'd like to see some thumbs up when we have our memory. Give y'all a few more seconds. Okay, here's the invitation. You have two choices. First, if you are feeling brave, which I would encourage you to feel, or strong, as Kaylin might say, then find somebody next to you and share that story. You'll not have a lot of time, but about 30 seconds each, and just try to share the heart of what felt meaningful about it to you. And if not, if you're feeling maybe a little bit quiet, then just kind of reflect on the experience yourself and see what kind of images and sensations come to mind. So take a few seconds to do that now. Get to a point where you can switch partners if only one person has been talking. Switch and listen to the other person. And come to a stop. Sorry to rush you. And bring your eyes back up here. Thanks for doing that. A few things I noticed were some smiles, some people leaning in, some hand gestures, somebody just kind of touched their heart. And ultimately, this presentation is kind of about exploring, like, how do we create those kind of moments? So if I was going to ask one of you, like, that was a really cool moment. What's your recipe? How could I have an experience like that? What would you say? And I actually do want to hear somebody give me their recipe. So if you're feeling particularly strong, raise your hand and we'll call on you. All right, Michaela.
I was in nature. You're looking at the stars.
Nature helped make it happen. Thank you. One more strong person. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, takes time, takes relationship, nature helps. This is the question we're going to explore, and in many ways, y'all already answered it, so we could stop now, but we got a few more minutes, so I'll just keep talking. And I want to tell you about a woman who very much influenced my work. Her name is Veronica Lack, and we'll talk about her book more in a second, but this is a quote from her book, which is, she talks about therapy as a full-bodied process where clients are supported to reoccupy parts of themselves that have been denied. That really resonated with me as a way to think about therapy. A lot of folks have talked about this idea of coming into sort of more full relationship with ourselves today. And something about this struck me in the way that we think about embodiment of these pieces of ourselves. And in the quote below, you also see that these are the dimensions of ourselves that if we can come into relationship with, deepen our appreciation for life. So this presentation is kind of an exploration of how do we find that secret recipe that y'all found for that moment, and specifically how do we do it with this population and working with horses. This is Frankie. Can everybody wave and say hi, Frankie? Frankie's probably my best horse co-facilitator. We've spent a lot of time together. Not always been smooth, but I think we've learned how to work with each other. And I want to tell a story now that is the kind of the core person who inspired me to want to do this presentation, and also is what makes it hard to do this presentation now. And this is a Vietnam veteran who passed away just less than 2 weeks ago. And I think since his passing, I've had this sort of resistance to wanting to get up here and talk. In some ways, it feels like this like pointless thing in relationship to somebody's life to stand up here and talk on a stage for 20 minutes. And I think that ultimately that was me kind of like in denial and doing some stages of grief that Chris will talk to us more about later. But kind of in having to do this presentation also, I think had to kind of move through this process a little bit more and actually reoccupy within myself some of these things that I was trying to push away. And I found this poem that I actually rediscovered it that talks about this very idea that when death happens, we sometimes feel like we're acting in this play that feels sort of phony in comparison. So I'm just going to say a quote from that poem, and then we'll kind of keep moving. It says, but when you left, a streak of reality broke in upon the stage through the fissure where you went. Green of real green, real sunshine, real forest. And I think if I have a hope for this presentation, it's that a little piece of his reality kind of settles in on the stage with me and with us, and y'all can feel some of his like beauty and compassion. And so I'm going to tell you a brief story to kind of kick us off, which is he came to, it's an 8-week veterans group that we run, and he came to every round of it for like 1.5 years. So we run it 3 times a year. And we would check in at the beginning of our sessions, and he would often identify feeling at a sort of lower emotional state, just like lower energy, and describe that as like not being motivated, had some like feelings of laziness that he described about himself. And then there was one time that we were with Frankie out in the pasture, and he said, I think I've just been really lonely. And this was a touching into an emotion that he hadn't described before, and I would maybe describe as reoccupying that feeling of loneliness for himself. And he identified that his wife had left him, and he never really understood why, and his dog had passed. And yet when he was there with the animals, he didn't feel as lonely. And after he had that moment of touching into his loneliness, I noticed that his check-ins tended to be higher. He tended to be in a more regulated, emotionally balanced state. And I think that was when it kind of clicked for me. Sometimes I think I was out in the pasture with people and I was like, what are we doing here? Like, I think I'm just standing here with a horse. What does that mean? And I think I realized like, oh, this is a process where something about that space allowed him to touch into this and then be more fully human. And so that's kind of what I want to explore in this presentation. I also just want to acknowledge that there are more people than me potentially in this room who have had a relationship with this man. And I just encourage you to take care of yourself in whatever way feels supportive to you during this next few minutes. So this is our flow. We're going to talk about horses, then about veterans, about the specific group. I'll give you a little bit of theory, and then a couple more stories, and then some things that I'm thinking about. Why horses? In some way, this question is still a mystery to me, but I'll hit on a couple of things that we see in the research and that resonate with me. First of all, we've had a relationship with horses for 5,500 years. Some of those relationships have been oppressive and cruel, and some of them have been incredibly beautiful, and some of them have been useful. But through that time, there's a mythology that we've developed and stories we've developed around horses, and you might even say that we've kind of co-evolved and learned how to be who we are in relationship with one another. Horses are also social beings. Like us, they live in herds in non-domesticated situations. They're very sensitive to each other. And there's this way that being in relational presence with them, like Maggie said, and like many people have talked about attachment, there's this way that we can actually explore the way we show up in relationships through the way we relate with a horse. And being sometimes beings that can be secure and grounded. They can let us see how we show up in ways that are non-judgmental, but still give us reflections of our own projections, the ways that we are believing and thinking about others, that can then give us some insight into how we relate to humans also. And finally, I'll say that horses are extremely sensitive. I've had clients get in touch with some emotional vulnerability, and a horse from 50 yards away has noticed and walked up to them in that moment. So they have an incredible ability to attune to us, and they also demand that we attune to them, both because of their size and because of their sensitivity, so that we also need to be knowing how to take care of ourselves and take care of them while we're around them. And I'll also just say there's an institute called the Heart Math Institute that thinks about our heart electromagnetic fields, which might sound a little woo-woo, and maybe it is, but there is some research around it, which says that horses' hearts are 10 times the size of a human heart, and they actually emit a larger electromagnetic field. And when we're in the presence of that, that can often be regulating in ways that they can measure through people's heart rate variability, which is a sign of how stressed we are. So these are some things that might imply horses could be useful, helpful co-facilitators, and that's been my experience. Briefly on the history of this work, as far back as 2,500 years ago, Hippocrates wrote about the therapeutic possibilities of being in relationship with horses. So we know that for time immemorial, it's been a thing that humans have thought about horses. And more recently, in the 50s, we started to think about in the West, the ways people could work with horses in an occupational therapy context, so more physical. In the 90s, we started to have the beginnings of what they called equine-assisted psychotherapy. There were some major organizations like PATH International that came about. In the next few decades, more and more organizations came about. Oprah interviewed people about equine therapy. It became popular, but still, even as recent as 2014, there wasn't a lot of research that supported it beyond being an experimental modality. And there's actually one article I read that was kind of like crushing to me, because it was like, equine therapy shouldn't be a thing because it's experimental and there's no research to support it. And I was like, oh no, I've been doing this internship. But fortunately, even though that was only a decade ago, actually in the past decade, we have started to see more research where they've had some larger sample sizes. They've been able to measure things, like I said, like heart rate variability, where we get better data, starting to have more longitudinal data, and more structured interventions that we can actually like replicate across different therapists. So I think there's increasing optimism that this could be a modality that's more mainstream, more covered by insurance, that's accessible to more people. I want to switch to talking about veterans now. Veterans come of a variety of backgrounds and experiences and have a variety of needs. These are some trends, though, that there's a higher risk of suicidality, and there's also, in these bottom two statistics, evidence that folks are not always seeking out support when they're dealing with mental health issues. And so that's really important for us to think about in the ways that we're facilitating this group. And again, understanding that there could be a variety of contexts that are leading them to having mental health needs that could be combat related, but also could be stress related to relocation from their service, or stress related to suddenly being in a less structured environment. Or even recently, we've unfortunately heard in the news that even the sensory exposure to large explosions can actually be damaging to our brains, even if we're not in combat, only in training circumstances. So it's a lot of complex needs that we're potentially seeing. And I also just want to address that we've started to see more and more folks who identify as women joining our groups, and military sexual trauma is not only happening to women in the military, but there is a high prevalence with women, and it has really severe effects. And so we just, again, want to be aware that when people are coming to our groups, they're also not necessarily coming with an experience of strong community from folks who are also identifying as veterans. And that's the thing that we just need to be aware of and supportive of. So as we think about that, I'm going to now shift us into how we think about running our group at Medicine Horse, which is, we've sometimes called it Operation Be Heard, as sort of a pun. 3 times a year, like I mentioned, so we run it spring, summer, and fall, 8 weeks long, 2 hours per session. And typically up to about 10 participants, with like 1 or 2 therapists and some horse handlers who kind of help hold the space and are trained to support therapeutically, but are not necessarily therapists themselves. And again, not everybody at Medicine Horse sort of uses the herd approach, but it's been super impactful for me, inspired by a mentor of mine. And so I want to kind of describe the way we run the group through this lens. I'm going to hit you with some theory. Sometimes I look at the words on this slide and I'm like, I get it. I definitely understand what it's saying. And then sometimes I'm like, I don't know what those words really mean. So if that's how you're feeling, that's okay. I read a whole book by Martin Buber, and sometimes I'm like, what does that mean? So just let it kind of wash over you, and then I'll try to simplify what it actually looks like with our veterans. First, there's this word phenomenology, which is the study of the way we directly experience the world. And Lack says it's important that we remember that our body is the way we experience the world. And so if we're helping clients come into contact with their experience, we're also helping them come into contact with their bodies. There's also this idea that, again, Martin Buber, you'll see a picture of him on the next slide. He's a Jewish mystic who believed that there is this kind of sacred relationship that can happen when, in the same story that you thought about at the beginning of this presentation, when I am fully in contact with another being. And he actually says all real living is meeting. So like I am more fully myself when I can be in true relationship. And this is an important idea for us. Existentialism, there's a lot here, but I'll just say that we believe that we allow our clients space to make their own meaning of experience rather than trying to tell them what the meaning is that they should be making. And finally, we want to help them think about this Gestalt idea of their present moment experience. So what is their personal experience of the world in this particular situation? How is that showing up in relationships? And then what can we understand about ourselves in other relationships? This all comes down to the same idea that we talked about earlier. When we support clients to notice how they show up in present moment relationship, we create space for them to reoccupy themselves. And I think, especially in the context of military veterans, this is a potent phrase, to reoccupy ourselves, because in the military context, occupation can seem violent. And in this context, we're talking about doing it with ourselves in a way that's healing. So again, very simple, actually, what this looks like in practice. By the way, this first horse is named Time Ahead. You want to say hi, Time? So first, we can just help clients be in the here and now. We can ourselves be present and help them notice what's happening in the present. One way we do that is through what and how observations or questions, simply getting them to notice and reflect back to them what their experience is, helps them see what choices they're making in the moment, which could be as simple as saying, what are you noticing about what the horse is doing? Or what did that bring up for you? And a big piece of that too is actually just me stepping back and creating space for the client to have that experience. And the experience that we're ultimately trying to foster through these practices is the I and thou relationship, which again, we believe it's intrinsically healing. I believe that those experiences you talked about at the beginning were intrinsically healing experiences for you. And if we can create space where people have those kinds of experiences, it actually reworks some of these attachment wounds that folks have talked about today. So in a flow of 8 weeks, what could this look like? We can think about it in 3 phases: meeting, relating, and integrating. And I want you to notice particularly, this is a framework that could be used for any group, but notice particularly how this might be impactful for folks who are veterans like we just described. So this emphasis that we have on choice and liberty might be unfamiliar to their experience of being in other veteran groups. And it could be challenging and scary, but could also be really healing to get in touch with what is it that I want in this moment. We offer some psychoeducation. We also offer opportunity for equine skills that are not focused on mastery, but again, focused on relationships. So we might teach folks how to groom or lead or pick the horse's hoof, or there's a method called the Masterson method that's kind of like gentle therapeutic touch. And again, all of this is like within the context of those 3 pillars for practice we talked about: getting people in the here and now, and in the present moment, and in relationship. And then finally, as we wrap up those 8 weeks, we often have opportunities for them to have embodied experiences of integration, which could or may not include a mounted session that's at a very slow walking pace. That's again just exploring another way to be in relationship. But the idea is that people can take these 8 weeks of experiential relationship with horses and with each other and bring that into their broader lives. The flow of a session might be something like this. Again, really just trying to create the container or structure for folks to have relational experiences. So sometimes we do some grounding at the beginning. After we do a little check-in, I'm going to show you how to do a horse breath. And then if you like it, you can do the second one with me. It's something that we do at Medicine Horse. It's complicated, but I think you'll pick it up. You got to breathe in. Do one more just in case you need it. And sometimes when we do that at the property, we actually see horses do the same thing when the group does it. It's kind of sweet. So I'm just going to end with a couple of quick stories. I already told you about my friend who passed. There's a couple more people I want to talk about. This is Bailey. Can everybody say hi, Bailey? I had a client who was who is active duty, is a leader both at work and also with her children. But in this moment of being with a horse out on a pasture, she was like, "Oh man, he just doesn't seem into me. He's just eating this grass." And I was like, do you want to try to get him to walk around with you instead of just eating the grass? And she's like, I don't know. Didn't want to be like intrusive. And then I just invited her to try it if she wanted to. And so she did. And for a while, he kept trying to eat, but she kept reminding him that that's not what they were doing right now. And they walked around and then he got it. And then suddenly she had this feeling of, oh, we're walking in connection. I'm feeling the rhythm of our pace. And it was a moment of reoccupation because she had this attitude toward leadership where her enacting leadership toward another was oppressive and was not something that she could do relationally. And then with his horse, it was like, oh, that actually felt connecting, even though I asked something of him. So that was cool. And it was cool. And again, in the context of somebody who's been in the military, maybe not as familiar of an experience of their time there. There's another client, and this was actually not a positive experience for her in the moment. This is a horse named Chip. Y'all want to say hi to Chip? And she was leading him and feeling proud of it. It was her first time leading a horse. And then we got into this indoor arena, and then Chip started being kind of antsy. And she's like, oh, he doesn't like my vibe, because we had told them how sensitive horses were. And I was like, in my head, I was like, come on, Chip, be nice so she can have a positive experience. And I also wanted to tell her, no, it's not you. It's just that he hasn't spent a lot of time in here. And so I wanted to explain the meaning to her, but I didn't. And just allowed her to be present with that, because this is a way that she may also bring that relational experience to other relationships in her life. And even though it's not positive, we're allowing her to touch into what that feels like. And ideally, over the course of time, have relational experiences that shift that for her and expand her ways of thinking about that. So Chip can show up the way he wants, is the point I'm trying to say. And that's good too, because we don't want horses to be just these like stoic, silent creatures. We want them to be fully themselves as well. And then finally, this is Cinco. And this, we had a client who had spent a number of groups, had come multiple times hanging out with Cinco, and we were showing folks how to clean hooves. And it can be scary to a horse to pick up its hoof, because if you think about it, that's its safety mechanism. It ultimately can flee if things are dangerous. And so when you have its hoof, it is no longer able to do that. So it has to trust you. And we were trying to show her how to do it, and Cinco wasn't really having it. He kept trying to put his foot back down. And we're the experts. And then she came and picked it up, and Cinco was like, sure, that's fine. And that just, again, shows that like somebody said, yeah, relationship, it takes time to develop relationship. And she had put that time in, and she got to have, again, this re-embodied experience of like, oh, I am somebody that another being can trust, and I can hold that for them, which was really cool. So those are my stories. These are just some final thoughts. One question, again, that an important mentor of mine has gotten me thinking a lot about is how therapeutic is this for horses? And the research is beginning around this, but one thing that seems to be true is that horses, when doing any kind of interactions with humans, feel safer and more connected when they have a longer term relationship with that human. So I think that it's incumbent upon me and anybody in this field to really develop relationships with the horses that you're bringing into relationship with your clients, because you can be an anchoring, grounding person for that horse until the horse develops a deeper relationship with your client. I'm also interested in like seeing more data, both at our organization and more broadly on the longer term impacts of equine facilitated psychotherapy so that it can be a broader, more accessible field. I am personally also, I've read a lot about other veterans programs. I'd like to spend some time in the future actually visiting some. And then finally, like I've mentioned, we have a lot of participants that come session after session, and I want to just do more thinking on how can we like deepen that experience for them the more times that they come. So these are things that are still lingering for me. Thank you all for your time. I'm here for questions, comments now and afterward. Appreciate it. I don't see any hands immediately, but again, find me if y'all want to follow up.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, that story of relationship and trust of being able to pick up the horse's hoof, such a solid visual and easily a felt sense for me. Our next presenter is Katie Clement. She's going to be talking about tending our emotions as a path home to ourselves. Let's welcome Katie.
A lot to bring up here. Oh my God, try to move. Okay. You might try this 5 times and it does it fine, and then when you get up here for your presentation. Okay. There we go. Thank you. Yeah. I knew it was going to do that to me. Okay. All right, so tending our emotions as a path home to ourselves. I just want to start by saying this has been my journey. I know what it's like to be on the other side of not knowing who I am, not knowing what I want, and following this path back to myself. And I stand before you as evidence that this is like a path to thriving. All right, so throughout my presentation, I'm going to be referring to the 4 basic emotions, which are anger, sadness, fear, and joy. And I represent these with the 4 elements of fire, water, air, and earth. I will be addressing what emotions are and what they actually feel like in our bodies, how we tend to our emotions, and then finishing by looking at ways that we avoid tending our emotions. So, what are our emotions? Carla McLaren states that emotions are literally energy that shows up in our bodies. And this energy is designed to motivate an action, There is something that your body wants you to do. Emotions are known in our body, not through our mind. Your mind, your complex brain that is conscious of all your social interactions, it is really good at telling you what you should be doing and what you should be feeling based on conditioning, based on how you were raised, cues that you're picking up in the social environment around you. But the truth of what you are feeling resonates deep in your body. As Yuko Lawrence states, we contain our emotions. We are not our emotions. Our emotions are flowing, shifting, communicating with us, telling us about who we are, but they are not who we are. I am a person who has a deep capacity to feel and experience sadness, but I am not sadness. Emotions can flow on through, or they can get stuck in our bodies. Peter Levine states that this energy, this emotion, biologically should flow through us as water flows through a stream. Animals have an innate, an instinctual capacity for allowing this energy to flow through their bodies. They can feel intense fear and then spend a few minutes shaking or pronking. And this releases the energy and allows it to flow on through, and they can go on about their day as if nothing had happened. And humans, as mammals, have this capacity to tend our emotions as well. So health is actually flow. It is not the absence of uncomfortable emotions like anger or fear or sadness. Those are a part of what it means to be human. I want to offer 2 guidelines for this work before I dive into how we tend our emotions. And these guidelines come from Julia Caldwell. The first is, we are the source of what we are feeling. Usually, when we feel an emotion, we immediately look outside of ourselves to try and figure out who or what caused me to feel this thing. But actually, my emotions are all about me. Different people respond differently to the same thing based on their own history, based on their values, based on how much sleep they got the night before. How many of you got a lot of sleep last night? Maybe even based on what they had for breakfast. So this is why your emotions are actually a path home to you. And the great thing about this is that I don't have to control the entire world or my partner or my kids in order to not feel something uncomfortable. This brings my power back to me, and my emotional state does not depend on somebody else. All right, the second guideline, anyone can feel anything at any time for any reason. We don't actually choose our emotion. It is just energy that shows up in our body. And because of that, there's no judgment on what you're feeling. You do get to choose how you respond to your emotions, but again, you can feel what you feel at any point in time. Okay, so how do we tend to our emotions? I'm going to break this down into a 4-step process. The first step is just to notice the physical sensations that are present in your body. This is about staying out of story and judgment, setting aside the why. Our thoughts about our emotion actually keeps us stuck in that state. So we accept and welcome what is present. You allow yourself to feel what you are authentically feeling in this moment, which in my body is a lot of energy. Hendricks states that problems persist to the extent that we fail to be present with them and the feelings associated with them. When we can simply be with an issue rather than trying to change it, the issue has room to transform in the desired direction. The most important healing strategy is being present. So the second step in tending your emotions is to label what emotion you are feeling. Research that Dan Siegel has done on our brains shows that labeling your emotion actually allows our bodies to downregulate. The third step is listening to what the emotion is telling you that you actually want on a deeper level. This is listening for your unarguable truth, and that's important. This step is not about the other person and what you want them to do. This step is all about you. So if what you think you want can be argued by somebody else, that's your clue to keep listening. So for example, I'm angry because you didn't clean the kitchen. Okay, but that's about the other person. And they could argue it. Yes, I did. Somebody else messed it up after I cleaned it up. So maybe my statement was true, maybe not. Maybe they cleaned it, maybe they didn't. But the truth of the statement doesn't matter. It's whether or not it could be argued. So then we listen deeper, listen to your body. Maybe I come up with, oh, the kitchen is a mess and that makes me feel stressed. We're getting closer, but that's about me. It's not about the other person anymore, but that's still a statement. It's not what I want. So then just pause, keep listening. What is my unarguable truth? What I really want is a sense of calm, relaxation, and rest. That's unarguable. You can't argue that that is what I want. And the kitchen might be a part of that. Maybe not. Maybe it is. But what I want you to notice is that when I got down to that statement, to that unarguable truth of mine, my power came back to me. I can choose now what I'm going to do in response to what I want, and I'm not dependent on you. I'm not a victim of what you either did or didn't do. That's a powerful distinction there. So discovering my unarguable truth is actually what enables me to set a boundary, to decide what I'm going to do in the present situation without trying to force or control the other person. It allows me to stay out of blame, and it honors the autonomy of both people. All right, the fourth step in tending our emotions is to notice if there's an expression of the emotion that's wanting to happen. This is about movement. Hendricks states that movement is a direct bridge to our inner life. Moving the way we feel authentically can actually build a rich inner life and also uncover what is false to ourselves. So, tending an emotion is about noticing, labeling, listening, and then expressing. This allows the emotion to deliver its message and for the energy of it to flow through our bodies. So we're not stuck in any one particular emotional state. Notice what is not on this list. Time. While this process does take time, time by itself does not help an emotion to flow through our body. Okay, so how do we know what emotion we're feeling? There are over 3,000 nuanced words for different emotions in the English language. And I don't know about you, but for me, that can be super confusing. How am I supposed to know what I feel when there's that many different words? So, following in the tradition of Carla McLaren, Julia Caldwell, and others, I work with the 4 basic emotions. And you can think of these as categories or families of emotion. And every emotion that we feel will fit into one of these 4 categories. And as a wilderness therapist, I believe that nature can teach us and guide us. So in the way that I work with these emotions in sessions with clients and in my own body, I relate each of them to one of the 4 elements: water, earth, air, and fire. Anger is fire. As you look at this image, just notice what physical sensations rise up in your body. Anger can show up anywhere along a spectrum of intensity, from mild annoyance or frustration all the way up to rage. And when it shows up in our body, it can feel really uncomfortable. A lot of us have experienced anger that wounded us, or we were handed negative beliefs about anger that said it was bad, or we were taught to suppress it, to not feel it, to deny that we're feeling it. But the problem is, untended, suppressed, ignored anger gets stuck. It actually builds in the pressure cooker of our bodies. And over time, it can become a destructive, raging wildfire that harms everything in its path, including our loved ones. But when we tend to our anger, it becomes our hearth fire, our home. It gives us our sense of self. It tells me the boundary of who I am. It tells me what my no is, my values, my beliefs, and my wants. All of this comes when we listen to anger. So anger usually has one of two messages for us. It can tell you about something that you're getting that you don't want, or it can tell you about something that you want that you're not getting. So one of those two. And remember, keep listening, because this is about you. Keep listening till you get down to your unarguable truth, the wisdom that resonates in your body about what you're wanting, what those messages are. And let the energy of anger move you towards what you want. Anger is motivating. That energy gets us somewhere, and it can be used for good towards our own thriving and towards the thriving of those around us. Think of the fight for justice. That's a way that we use anger for the good of the whole. So what sensations might be in my body when I'm experiencing anger? We might feel a tightness or contraction in your neck, your shoulders, maybe your jaw or your back. Your hands can clench or tighten. You might just feel like heat that rises in your body. It can be intense. And when we really allow ourselves to feel that energy surging through our body, it can feel scary, but lean towards it. Expressing the energy of it is what allows it to flow through us. Some possible ways that anger might want expression can be through pushing on something, like pushing on a wall or a lovely podium, or hitting something like a pillow or a couch. Yelling can actually release it. And sometimes just noticing how angry we really are is enough to allow the energy of it to flow through our bodies. So the point here is not that the next time you go out, you say, well, Katie told me to push on a wall, so I'm going to try that. It's more that the point is for you to listen to your body and what it wants in that moment. These are some options that some people notice. Oh, when I'm feeling angry, this is what is helping. But really listen in that moment to what your body wants. One other thing that it's important to note about the expression of anger is that this does not mean that you have permission to do any of these things to or at someone else, and maybe not even in the presence of somebody else, if that might be scary to them. So you might have to take your space, you might have to go for a walk, find an empty room to express it and let that energy flow. And then come back when you're a little more regulated and you can communicate with boundaries, with clear communication. All right, I wanted to tell you about a client of mine. We'll call her Delany. I worked with her this whole last year. She's a 30-year-old cisgender female, white, who came into therapy struggling with depression. We spent most of our sessions outdoors as long as the weather allowed us to be out there. And in our recent work together, Delany has come to sessions with a lot of anger towards her partner, which she explains as anger that he is not doing what he said he would do. Delany claims he is dropping into his vices of drinking, pot, and video games instead of working productively in their shared family business. It's a big deal. Delany states she doesn't know what to do to get him to step up, and the conflict had eroded their relationship to the point where they were hardly speaking to each other. Delany had told me that their connection was at a zero. As Delany leaned towards her anger in session, allowing it, noticing it, listening to it, labeling it as anger, she realized that what she was truly wanting was connection, and for the two of them to be at least working to improve their relationship. She found ways in session to feel and express the energy of anger. One of her favorites was just to tense up her whole body and then just yell what she was angry about. And that worked to release the energy. So anger showed her what boundaries she wanted to have in her relationship with her partner, and that the silence and stagnation wasn't working for her. She wanted them to be intentionally working on their relationship, or she would end it. That was what she was going to do. Danny gave her partner space to choose whether he wanted to re-engage in this way in their marriage or not. This was very different from how Danny was attempting before to force or coerce him into behaving in a certain way. So there's a release. The transformation in Danny was amazing to watch. From an angry, tense, resentful person, I watched her face clear, her sense of power returned, her whole posture changed as she stood straighter, and the light in her eyes returned. She told me that she had a sense of calm again. Her anger didn't feel like it was about to explode out of her all over her partner. Her partner also noticed a difference when she was able to communicate with him about her desire for connection without blame. He responded in kind, expressing his own desire for connection, and the two of them have started to speak again and to work on the issues that were stuck between them. All right, I'm going to move on to sadness, which I represent with water. Notice the physical sensations that you feel in your body when you see this image. Sadness can feel like the ocean crashing over our heads, like we're drowning or a riptide is going to pull us out to sea. Our current sadness can actually connect us with past sadnesses that we have felt that we never allowed ourselves to fully experience. There can be a lot there when we begin to lean towards it and allow ourselves to feel the sadness, which can be super scary. That makes us want to suppress it or lean away from it and not tend to it. But as we tend to our sadness, we can become the banks of the creek. Allowing yourself to feel and express your sadness allows it to flow on through. The message of sadness, it tells us about a loss that we are experiencing of someone or something that we felt attached to. Grieving, this is a part of sadness. And grieving is allowing ourselves full expression of our sadness, allowing ourselves to feel what we are feeling for as long as we are feeling it. It's how we honor the importance of what we have lost, and it's how we say our goodbyes. Depression is another form of sadness. This is literally sadness that is stuck, compressed in our bodies. So it's sadness that has not been tended, not allowed to have expression or flow. And when sadness shows up in our bodies, some of the physical sensations that you might feel can just feel like a heaviness, maybe in your chest or your full body, a tightness in your throat, or sensation behind your eyes, tearing. And the expression that sadness might want could be through crying. It could be through rest or stillness, and through just noticing how sad you really are, without judgment. I want to go back to my client, Danny. I told you that Danny had come into therapy for depression. At the beginning of our work together, Danny told me that she was having a hard time feeling any happiness. She felt a deep sense of sadness all the time, and she wasn't sure why she felt sad. She told me she shouldn't be sad. But as we leaned in session towards her sadness, she spoke of how afraid she was to cry because she was afraid she wouldn't be able to get back out of the sadness. That's that fear of drowning. But in the safe space of the container of therapy, she allowed herself to just notice the heaviness that she felt. And the tears began to flow. And she realized that what she was really sad about was the death of her grandfather, whom she'd been really close to, and he had passed away just a couple of months prior. His death was also triggering her grief about the death of her grandmother a couple of years ago. As she allowed herself to notice how sad she was, staying out of the story in her mind, which was telling her that she shouldn't still be grieving, she gave herself permission to feel what was present, and this allowed for a powerful shift in her. She cried in session for a long time, letting that river of sadness flow through. At the end of that session, Danny had a look of peace on her face. I get the chills every time I remember that moment in her. She told me that she could feel the presence of her grandmother with her, smiling at her. She told me that she could breathe easier and that the heaviness had lifted. She was able to feel joy again, thinking of her memories of the good times that she'd had with her grandmother, rather than feeling the clenched heaviness and weight of the unprocessed grief. All right, we're going to shift to fear. So this is air. Some of the things that fall into the family of fear can be anxiety, worry, confusion, all the way up to full body panic. Fear can feel like the energy and chaos of a hurricane swirling around inside of us, threatening to destroy everything in its path. But noticing that we are not our fear, that fear is just something that's showing up in our bodies in that moment, that allows us to root ourselves in the eye of the hurricane. It allows us to find our own strength and safety in the midst of the chaos that is swirling around us. Oop, did I just skip something? Yeah. Fear arises when our body perceives a threat. Whether there is actually a threat or not is not important. It's what your body is perceiving. And fear can be felt, again, in degrees of intensity, from butterflies in your stomach all the way up to this full body fight, flight, or freeze response. It can feel like agitation, muscle tension, your pulse and breath, breathing rate might go up. Sometimes you just have this like sense of urgency, like I gotta get somewhere else than here. And some forms of expression that fear might want can be shaking, quaking, pronking, running, or just letting yourself notice and feel how scared you actually are. Back to my client, Danny. I told you that about the anger that she had been feeling in relation to her partner. There's another piece to that story. Once Danny had listened to and processed her anger, as she kept leaning towards the physical sensations that were showing up for her, she noticed a lot of agitation and muscle tension that she realized was actually fear. Previously, she hadn't even been conscious that she was experiencing any fear. As she listened for what she was afraid of, she realized the threat that her body was perceiving and that it was her deepest fear cropping up, her fear of failure. She was afraid that she was a person who had failed, that she had married the wrong person. When Danny first allowed herself to lean towards that fear, her entire body froze. The experience of fear was that visceral and intense. She told me that it felt like she wouldn't survive this fear. As she began to name the fear out loud, and she held the reality that she might indeed have failed, have married the wrong person. In the space of the therapy session, she was able to notice all the physical sensations in her body and how completely enmeshed her entire identity was with being a person who did not fail. Using nature, Danny was able to ground and resource herself, and she noticed that the fear began to dissipate. She was able to make different statements about herself. She said, "I am a person who can make mistakes." This was the beginning of another profound shift for Danny, a shift towards accepting herself, feeling rooted in who she was. In the eye of the hurricane, she was able to find safety. Noticing and processing her fear allowed her to shift out of the blame that she had been feeling towards her partner. She had needed him to be someone he wasn't because she couldn't face the fact that maybe she'd made a mistake in marrying him. She couldn't tolerate facing her own fear. So by embracing her fear, she was able to release her partner to be himself. And in turn, she was able to step into her own freedom to be fully herself as well. She found that her body was able to relax, and I could see the tension leave. Her entire face shifted, and her eyes were looking up again. Her body was no longer perceiving a threat. And she told me with a sense of awe in her voice that she felt strength and power. All right, the final emotion that I'm going to talk about today is joy, which is the earth element. This is your sense of groundedness or rootedness, calm or excitement. This is our sense of acceptance, appreciation. This is where creativity and imagination live, and our sense of well-being. Joy can have two forms in our body. It can be a really excited energy, or it can be that calm peacefulness. And some of the sensations that you might feel, there's a sense of expansion, of flow, of connection with the things around you. There can be a warmth, very different than the heat of anger. And it often is centered in your heart or your chest area and then expands out from there. In the excited form of joy, you can feel that the energy, the buzzing rise, and your muscles might activate and be ready to move. In the peaceful form, your muscles might relax, your breathing slows. And finally, joy might want expression through spontaneous movement. Think of a child that's just like freely moving in congruence with what they notice inside. Or sometimes even just noticing the calm peacefulness that you feel. Don't skip over that part. Our tolerance actually to feel joy is pretty low. There's a lot of research out there about that. But noticing it, naming it, actually can root yourself in this state. And then back to Dani. As I shared earlier, through leaning towards and processing the uncomfortable emotions in her body, she was able to shift back into a state of joy and feel her power and her strength again. She told me that she began to look forward to going home and that she and her partner were speaking again and that the connection between them had improved. I don't know what the future will hold for them, but that's a good step. All right. So I want to talk briefly, don't have a lot of time, but ways that we avoid feeling our emotions. So this is a big topic in and of itself. I don't have time to go into much detail, but there's a lot of them. And this list is pretty familiar to me. I'm good at a lot of these. But as you just let your eyes scan this list, maybe pick out one or two that you're like, oh yeah, I do that. And my point here is just to use this as your cue that you've left tending your emotions and that maybe what you could do in response is just to tend them. Pause, breathe, and then notice, label, listen, and express. So tending our emotions is about tending to the wholeness of who we are and the wisdom of your body. It's stepping into the freedom to live the life that you truly want. This is stepping into thriving. Thank you. Good. I see Heather. Okay. If you have any questions later.
Tending those emotions. I could feel the joy just looking at Katie's smile as she was leaving the stage and probably from sharing this content, but also being done. Thank you, Katie. Next up, Mantha Svendsen. Decolonizing the mind of the queer body. Let's welcome them to the stage.
Hey, everybody. I'm gonna set this up real quick. How's everyone doing? Tell me on the count of three. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right. Cool, cool, cool. Oh, thanks. Grandma, can you hear me? Grandma, can you hear me? All right, perfect. Okay. Oh, that's my screen. How cool is that? Okay. Oh, great. Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Mantha. I use they, them pronouns, and I identify as non-binary. And by being up here, I'm inspired by Katie. I'm feeling a bit of fear and a bit of joy. And it's a lot to be a queer body up here. And I'm really happy that my loved ones are here and on Zoom. And you mean the world to me. Yay. So also shout out to the cohort. Love y'all. Okay. All right. So there are a few things I want to acknowledge before diving in. The first being that we are all standing on the unceded territory of the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne people. And by us learning on this land, even if you are just coming in for today, that is an act of colonialism. I'm a white body that is using the term decolonizing as a form of metaphor and analogy, and in the context of the mental health industrial complex. That is inherently a privilege that I hold in order to do so. I will be poking holes into the therapy world and larger oppressive systems on a whole. By doing so, I want to hold them accountable for the harm that they have caused and continue to be complicit in. I will be saying things that might make you feel uncomfortable, get defensive, annoyed, or feel as if it does not apply to you because you're one of the good ones. I urge you to let whatever arises be a sign that leads you to curiosity. And if you do feel uncomfortable or defensive, I urge you to let that be a marker of the things that the oppressive systems have allowed you to feel comfortable in. And additionally, this is not just for queer people, this is for all of us because we are all a part of the system. And finally, before beginning this work and researching, I did not feel confident in continuing as a therapist after graduation day. But because of this research and the brilliant, brave minds that have shared and endured, I feel more inspired now to show up and to hold others and the industry and myself accountable. So if you find yourself feeling like Mantha's really critical, it's because I am, and I'm doing it out of deep, deep love. So you also might feel like, Mantha, what are we doing here? There's so many weird things that you're saying to me. And so if you get lost, just come back to this. The goal of this presentation is to advocate and strive for true healing and liberation for all people. So this will be our little timeline. We have a little tree buddy. So we'll start out with the roots, and those will be two different modalities. So we'll have internal family systems, which a lot of people have already talked about today. And then the second modality will be decolonizing therapy. Then we will move into the STEM, which will be those two modalities merging into a queer body and a queer experience. And then the growth will be an actual case study of that in my internship. And then the bloom is a call for liberation, both internally and externally. So we will begin with internal family systems. Also, there'll be little dudes that will follow us along in this journey, and I drew the little dudes. So, hey. Okay, so internal family systems, which is often referred to as parts work, was popularized by Richard Schwartz in the 1980s. And to help us understand internal family systems better, we can think of our family systems that we are a part of. Those relationships had a lot of nuances and different levels of development and power. Internal family systems suggest that we also have these family systems inside of us. So there are three different sort of umbrella terms of different types of parts within us. So we're going to go over them now. So the first one are the managers. So the managers are the parts that run the show, and they keep us in line, and they make sure that we get things done. They often make us very successful. The second type of parts are firefighters. So these parts make sure that when there's a sign of fire, whether that's internally or externally, or something that makes us feel deeply uncomfortable, the firefighters come in and save the day, which is amazing, except when the firefighters save the day, just like in real life, they can leave behind a big mess to clean up. And finally, we have the sweet little cute exiles. And these are the parts of us that were developed very young, and at some point were locked away, not to be seen by anyone. And although these three parts sound very different, there's a likeness in all of them, and they're here to protect us and keep us safe. So you might be asking yourself at this point, Mantha, what can parts actually look, feel, and act like? So we're gonna get a little glimpse inside of my internal world, and we are going to meet my guilt part. So everyone, say hello to my guilt part. Hi, guilt. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, so this is a very special part of me. This is the first part that I ever identified with my therapist 3 years ago. And they pointed out to me that I had these patterns of expressing guilt in my life. And I was like, what? Is that what that is? And then they had, at some point during that experience, they said, can you remember the first time that you ever experienced guilt? And I was flashed back into the Burger King play place in Brainerd, Minnesota, with my Aunt Laura and my grandma and my 2 brothers. And my brothers had a thing at the time where they would take off the straw wrapper and then they blow into it and the wrapper would like fly at someone. And I was that someone that would always get hit. And that day was the day that I was gonna get them back. So I was fiddling with the wrapper on the table. I was like, oh, I'm gonna get them, I'm gonna get them. So I go up and I'm getting ready and I blow into the straw and the wrapper flies. My brothers dodge it and it hits an old man sitting, eating alone. And even as I think about it now, this shadow comes over me and I'm like, oh God, I'm the worst person ever. And I felt like that as a 5-year-old. And when I explained that to my therapist, they were like, okay, great. So when that guilt comes up, talk to them like they're 5 years old. I was like, okay, we can try that. And then as I started doing that, I noticed that my guilt part was growing up. I was reparenting my guilt part. And now I see guilt as such a friend of mine. They help me to know where to be accountable and where to show up more. And guilt also allows me to see what is my own internal guilt and what is the external guilt that is put on me by systems. And an example of this in my queer experience is that for a very long time, I felt really, really guilty about being queer. I thought it was a really bad thing. And I thought that it would be a really guilty act of me to ask others to refer to me with different pronouns. And so for a very long time, I didn't ask this of the people in my life. And in now asking that, I feel as if this guilt is like, oh yeah, go Mantha. So, they can grow up, they can become something else. And this is just one example of one part of my many parts and of all of our parts, and one example of what that looks like in a queer experience. So there are 4 goals of internal family systems: to liberate, to restore, to reharmonize, and to establish self-leadership. So we're going to close up that root system as we go to the next therapy modality, which is decolonizing therapy. I will say during this section, I will be bringing up things that are really traumatic and are really sad. And so if those defensive parts come up of you, please meet them with curiosity. And if there's a pain that arises in you, please just care for yourself during this. So decolonizing therapy, this book was so influential for me in my life and in this work. It was written by Jennifer Mullen in 2023, and it's called Decolonizing Therapy: Oppression, Historical Trauma, and Politicizing Your Practice. Jennifer Mullen suggests that decolonizing therapy is at the intersection of the psychological, the political, the ancestral, and the collective. Decolonizing therapy is a curious and loving but urgent call to bravely and earnestly confront the multi-generational impact of colonization on all of us, to uncover and tend to the real roots of symptoms and suffering, and to recenter a collective healing process for all Indigenous people globally, and for those forcibly displaced and made to engage in emotional and physical labor in order to survive. It calls for an end to individualistic and pathologizing Eurocentric methods of wellness. one that includes those who have been purposely excluded and historically forgotten. It demands a model of mental health that is accessible to all and that offers a path to liberation and thriving. Our current approach to mental health is steeped in colonialism. Therefore, it can never lead to true healing and liberation for all people. Decolonizing therapy is breaking and questioning the cycles of, because that's the way it's always been, responses. Emotional decolonization involves coming to awareness, unlearning, grieving, raging, and divesting from the lies we've been told by colonizers perpetuated by a white lens. So we're going to go into the mental health industrial complex. This has been mentioned a couple times today, so I'll just tell the definition again if it's been said. It refers to a multi-billion-dollar health industry composed of the vast number of care providers within the mental health industry. Often, the mental health industrial complex seeks to explain suffering through biomedical means, attributing things to inherent problems in the brain when it is actually caused by social or political factors that affects a person's life. Overall, this leads to more medication prescriptions and more revenue for an industry that is not set up to heal or solve these systematic issues because it treats them as individual. The mental health industrial complex and those that profit off of it, such as universities as this one, is rooted in white supremacy, racism, sexism, colonialism, fat phobia, transphobia, queerphobia, and xenophobia. We can see these toxic roots of the MHIC being pathologized for queer people. Homosexuality was a diagnosis in the DSM until 1973. And gender dysphoria is a diagnosis that is often given to queer folks in order to get gender-affirming healthcare covered by insurance, which is inherently problematic because a massive element of that dysphoria is because external family systems, school systems, workplaces, and systems by and large are not equipped to love, accept, and affirm people as they are learning who they are in this world. Queer people, specifically non-cis people, are given diagnoses such as anxiety, depression, defiance, and adjustment disorders. All these diagnoses can be true for individuals, but it is crucial that those internal things are held and analyzed in relation to the external world as well. So I want to go into two other diagnoses. These were created by a pro-slavery physician named Samuel Cartwright in the mid-1800s. Samuel Cartwright was chosen to be the committee head of investigating, researching, and reporting on diseases that were specific to Black people. Through his research, he reported that Black people are very different psychologically from white people, possessing smaller brains, more sensitive skin, and overdeveloped nervous systems. He said that these traits gave Black people a higher propensity for servitude. He created the diagnosis drapetomania, which was nicknamed runaway slave. He described drapetomania as a curable mental disease, and that when infected with this, enslaved Black people were struck with an urge to flee bondage and seek freedom. The treatment to this disease, as he called it, was through higher amounts of labor, beating, and amputation. The second diagnosis that he created was called diaesthesia aethiopica, which proposed a theory for the cause of laziness among enslaved people. He described commonalities that he noticed among free Black people and those on badly governed plantations and any person refusing to work for a white master. It is important to note that these examples of scientific racism continue to show up in our covert and overt relations. We can see this with political protests, murders of civilians by police officers, and ideations of Black people today. Once again, the roots and expressions of colonization continue to impact Black people's safety, treatment, and emotional bandwidth today. It is clear that there was a cognitive incapacity to view occupied people's demands for freedom as earnest. And although Cartwright's diagnoses seem out of date and absurd for right now, if one breaks down his claims to their simplest terms, one sees that the racial regime that led him to invent these two diagnoses are the same racial regimes that lead therapists to diagnose defiance, hyperactivity, attention deficit disorder among adults in custody, students, and clients. And furthermore, we can see that when people still call for liberation of the enslaved and occupied today, people are still pathologized. People's demands are intellectualized and labeled and met with violence and repression from the state. People are met with the output of white supremacy. We can see this in the civil rights movement, protesting the Vietnam War, the Black Lives Matter protests, and we are seeing this every single day with pro-Palestinian protests in response to the ongoing genocide occurring in Gaza. Decolonizing therapy is a way of questioning the ingrained habits of the industry and bringing to light the oppressive systems that have helped build and sustain the mental health industrial complex. Before we move on, I just want us all to take some collective breaths together. This information is a lot to learn or be reminded of. I urge you to take care of your needs, and if that defensive voice is arising, get curious about that and not allow yourself to distract yourself from that emotion. So now that we've gone over both of those therapy modalities, we are going to go into how do internal family systems, decolonizing therapy, and queer people intersect. So to begin, our parts internally learn how to act by using the external world as a role model. As we've discussed, the external world is one that is steeped in colonialism and oppression. Our parts learn how to silence one another and learn how to absorb our harmful rhetorics, and in really harsh terms, they learn how to oppress different parts of ourselves. Combining decolonizing therapy and internal family systems in queer bodies allows for relationships of oppression to be questioned, observed, and if need be, abolished. And when we start to dismantle the systems of power and oppression within us, we start to emulate liberation within our bodies, our relationships, and it allows us to have a lens of liberation that we can look at the rest of the world with. Parts work can be a brilliant tool of internal liberation, but we must hold that with the external liberation that decolonizing therapy provides. When internal liberation is had through internal family systems, the external world does not have the capacity to meet that liberation, which leads to discomfort and isolation, which further provides the systems of oppression with power. So we're going to go into a case study for my internship this year. I was also at the Momentum Counseling and Consulting with Tessa this year, and most of my clients were queer, and this is a queer client of mine that I started really doing both of these modalities with in January. This client is in their late 40s, and they self-identify as bisexual, disabled, non-binary, and an anarchist, and they use she, they pronouns. So we started sessions in November, actually, and they were living in disability housing on a third floor in an apartment that was infested with mold. They have a severe allergy to mold, which in the first month of working together, they actually ended up in the hospital 3 times, and the last time being from a stroke due to the mold. So you can imagine that until she got out of that housing, we couldn't really dig into the deeper parts of her. But then when we did in January, we found that they had this really, really prevalent manager part, which was based in this logic and really was so controlling of her heart and her body. So this client reached out to me about 3 days before a session, and they were like, I need you right now. Like, I need to have a session right now. And I was like, okay, yeah, let's go. So we got on a telehealth session, and I could see immediately that they were in a ton of pain. They couldn't stand or sit without wincing. And they had informed me that their PCP had not filled out their application for disability and that they were uncertain of doing so, which would dramatically change her life. So I instantly went into like, okay, let's work both with the internal and the external in this moment. So I said, let's put objects out on the table in front of you that represent the systems and your PCP, and let's allow different parts of your body to express themselves at this moment. And her face sort of like all scrunched up, and she's like, absolutely not, I'm not going to do that. And I was like, Okay, so it seems as if the manager part is present at this moment. And I'm curious what the manager part needs right now to take a step back. And then they informed me that the manager wanted to be affirmed and validated and be affirmed that they could also come back into the space once the body and the heart had time to express themselves. So we both did that. And then I said, okay, so let's just tap into your body and your heart and all the parts that belong there and that are rooted in there. What do they want to say? And she began to cry. And then for the next about 20 minutes of the session, we just spent a lot of our time weeping and raging and grieving with one another, which is a deep, deep honor to do with this client. And after this happened, I said, can we check in with the manager part and see what's going on with them? And they began to cry again, and they said, my manager is doing exactly what the systems are doing. And that was such a breakthrough in our work together, and we still continue to come back to this moment. So I said, okay, can we check in with your body? How's that pain feeling? She said, well, I'm still in pain, but I can feel my back again. There was some release there. And so not only do we interact with these systems of oppression on an external level, it's also in our bodies. And so when we work with that internal liberation, we're able to have a sense of liberation inside of our bodies. And I want to note that within our work, I'm always talking about how what we're doing in this session, oh, I forgot to do this. What we're doing in these sessions do not directly impact the external systems. But what it does do is allow us to see a creek of liberation within inside of us that then changes our lens for the world and demands more. We demand more for the world. So we are going to move into the last part of this presentation, which is a call for liberation, both internally and externally. Therapists are taught to medicalize and treat symptoms and ignore the core wounds of historical trauma and colonization. We are taught to victim blame by focusing on person deficiencies and trauma rather than structural violence. The systems are working exactly as they were intended to. When a society is not equipped to hold up an accurate mirror to ourselves, we end up interpreting our reflection according to the available structures and terminologies. Not taking any action is a political message that supports the systems and people in power. So I urge you, when you are explaining to yourself or others that you are doing something because it's always been that way, get curious about the roots of that. And I urge you to question the systems of a power externally in your life and deepen that curiosity inward and really sit with the ways in which these power systems work within your system and uphold and sustain harmful and oppressive rhetorics. I urge you to share with your loved ones and colleagues what you uncover when thinking and acting on liberation in your internal and external world. And I urge you, if you are a therapist, to decolonize your practice. You can start small, you can start large, but please just start. And I urge you to hold yourself, your relationships, your places of work, the communities that you are in, the schools that you are a part of, and most certainly the government that we exist in, accountable for the complicit and explicit ways of supporting and sustaining oppression. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Aw, that's so sweet. Yeah. Does anyone, we're done? We're good? We're on time? Okay, cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mantha. As evidenced by all the folks standing up, I think we felt that call to action and that curious nature. Up next, Chris Mitchell. There is a lot of grief in the room, examining grief, ritual, and letting go in the therapeutic context. Let's welcome Chris.
Let me see one thing. That's probably a little bit better. Can everybody hear me? Cool. As we begin, I want to invite you all to take care of your needs. We got some comfy spots over here. We got space to move your body, shake, breathe, because we're about to dive into some heaviness. Ambiance crew. As I get started this afternoon, I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of grief in this room today, and that is okay. You'll find out in a moment that if we love things in life, we will lose them. All right, so what's going to happen is we'll go through grief and its stages. We'll also talk about the gates that we can use to enter grief. I'll talk through my case presentation, the who and the what. We'll talk about rituals, grief, and supportive modalities that I've used with my client over the past year, and then some ways to tie it all together. But first, a moment or two about myself and why grief matters. My story comes with a lot of loss, but that loss was necessary for me to stand up here today to talk to you all and to make my way towards graduation and becoming a licensed therapist. I've lost both my parents, an aunt, a best friend, and others. Each of those losses had a profound impact on me, and I would not be here today if I didn't have those losses and was able to work through them. And so we'll take a few moments here to talk about grief and its stages and the gates. So back in the day, Kubler-Ross came up with the 5 stages of grief. And since then, we've kind of reimagined it to have 7 stages. And the way it's presented, it's kind of this list, this checkbox kind of action, but it is far from it. But when we experience a loss, there's the initial shock and denial. Oh, this definitely couldn't have happened. There's no way that this person is gone. We head into pain and guilt, pain of the loss, and guilt for being the one who survived, or not being able to connect with them before you lost them. We can get angry and want to bargain. Oh, if I could just have one more day with them. We can sink into a low-weighted depression. And then oftentimes there's an upward turn. We begin to pick up the pieces of our life, the life of the people that we've lost. We begin to restructure and working through the impact that this grief has had. And sometimes we can get to a place of acceptance or installation of hope. Yalem. I want you all for a moment to think back to a time in life when you felt grief. Did you ever get to acceptance? Or have you ever had another stage resurface? There's a reason why in the past slides that I used a helix. And that is because even if we do get to acceptance, anniversaries, memories can send us back into another stage and to work and honor those stages. Even today, I speak to you all a week after the anniversary of losing my mother 7 years ago. And with that anniversary coming up, it threw me back into different stages. I let myself cry. And that kind of brings us to Francis Weller, who wrote Wild Edge of Sorrow. And he talked about these 5 ways, these 5 gates that we can enter grief. The first being to love is to accept the rights of grief. Grief can be a gift. And if we love something, we are going to lose it at some point. And that can make you feel isolated and alone, but I think it connects us. And I'll get to that in a little bit. To talk through some of the other gates. Everything we love, we will lose, as I said before. The places that have not known love. The sorrows of the world. What we expected and did not receive. And ancestral grief. And so we've got some ways to look at grief, some lenses to use. We'll talk about ritual and ways that you can get through. So I'm about to dive into my client and what I found about rituals and modalities that help my client and honestly help myself. I got the amazing opportunity to intern at Naropa Community Counseling. Thank you. And one of my first clients was someone who I will call AM. And when AM sat down, just to give a little background, AM is a 34-year-old white, cisgendered, queer individual who uses he, him pronouns. And in our intake, I was just completely struck by how much trauma AM had faced living in a queer body. It was not a one-time thing, but many. And his way of coping with all of these traumas was to dive headfirst into alcohol. He had also just gone through major transitions in life. He grew up loving creative endeavors like sewing and working with fabric. And his career up until that point had been in some creative realms. But because of his drinking, he lost that job and was forced to hit rock bottom, pick himself up, and figure out the next step. He mentioned hesitance of working not only with a male identifying client, but just with therapists in general, because his previous experience with therapy was they ripped the trauma Band-Aid off before they had built any kind of safe container, which marked flashbacks for him, reliving all of the traumas that he had faced in life. So in that intake, I knew I wanted to take it slow, to build him up and figure out what he was holding on to and what he needed to let go of. And we'll pause there for now on AM. I looked at a few different studies of grief and of ritual. And across all of the research that I looked at of 4 different studies, it found that ritual help with processing grief. And it became apparent to me in doing my own ritual work of the power of ritual and grief as well. Another study that you can check out in my annotated bibliography is that altars and objects can be helpful. Things to remind yourself of what was lost. Things to remind yourself of the power that you have as well. Objects and altars help. In my research, I got to connect with someone who made a huge impact, and I wish I could do an entire presentation on them. A ritual and grief worker named Wendy Cass. And I'll get a little bit more into Wendy's lineage and background here in a little bit. But in our discussion, we were talking about what kind of rituals can work, if we should do lineage or not. And she told me that creative ritual is for everyone. We all benefit from ritual. And if we can create a ritual that makes sense to us, it'll impact us. Another notion that she said was community moves mountains. Oftentimes, we come together when we've experienced a loss. We go to a funeral, we do a celebration of life, a memorial service, and then after that, we're left to our own devices, individually expected to pick up all the pieces and sort through our grief. But if we do this in community, the power that is had can move mountains. And the last thing I'll really drive home is that when we're in grief, when we make altars, we are in relation to the other world. No matter what beliefs you hold, this notion that our dead go somewhere and we can still connect to them. And the big thing here is the other world is hungry for what we want to give it. Whether it be our anger, our sadness, our pain, our joy in remembering who or what we have lost. No matter what it is, the other world is hungry for what we have to give it. All right, so to give some context here, when I started working with AM, we started slow, and I'll get to some modalities that helped us get there and helped us continue our work together. But it just became so abundantly apparent to me that there was something holding my client back, that was holding AM back. He felt this need to pay penance for what had happened to him, whether it be parking at the furthest parking space in a parking lot, so he had to walk all the way in to work. But he felt he didn't deserve the goodness in life, that he had to pay penance for what had happened to him. And there was a stuckness. If we're talking about the stages here, he was bargaining. Oh, if I do this, if I pay this penance, if I hold this against myself, then maybe I'll get through it. And within all of this, it sparked a memory for me. of work that I had recently done. As part of this program, we are given the amazing opportunity to do a rite of passage. And in my own grief journey, there was much that I felt that I needed to do, to let go of some things that my parents had put on me that I felt it was time to pass back to them. And so in doing my own work, I knew that my rite of passage solo had to do with grief. JC knew that this was work that I wanted to do. And JC had just done a grief ceremony with Wendy and another person named Beth Erlander. She came up to me and she began talking about a specific grief ritual ceremony that comes from the Dagara people of Africa. And that was brought here by Malidoma Some and Sobonfu Some, and Wendy is part of that lineage. And so I took inspiration from this Dagara style grief ritual and I made it my own. In both rituals, mine and the Dagara people, there's altars that are used. For the Dagara lineage, it focuses on ancestors, an altar for grief, and an altar for self-forgiveness. Now, I wanted to take some aspects of that, but I knew that there was anger that I had to work through. So I brought something to represent my anger. I knew that there was a big pool of sadness. And so I brought something to represent my sadness. And finally, I felt that I needed to get power back from my ancestors. So I made an altar, wrong wrist, that represented my ancestors. And over the course of those 3 days and 3 nights, I did as much grief work as I could. And now to go back to AM, knowing that he had something that he was holding on to that wanted to move, wanted to be let go, I talked to him about and did some careful self-disclosure around the grief ritual that I had done and created for myself, using inspiration from the Dagara people and Malidoma Some's lineage. He pricked up and he felt that even the altars that I talked about were altars that would work for him. And so together we went outside and he brought a black stone to represent his anger over what had happened to him. He brought water from a moon ceremony that he had done to represent his sadness and to connect back to his roots with sewing and working with fabric. He brought sewing needles that his past grandmother had given him and that he had found when he was dealing with her grief, or with the grief of her. And we set it up in a triangle formation, these 3 altars, and he stood in the center and he quietly whispered to each one. And I witnessed him shedding the weight that had been holding him down, that had been causing him to pay penance. And it was amazing to witness, and brings in this idea of grieving in community. But that was just one moment in our work together. I'll bring us back to the second gate. This gate brings forward the parts of us that we hid away. As Katie brought up in her presentation, this idea of tending to emotions, the more and more we tended to his grief, the more and more space that he had to recognize the work that he wanted to continue doing. Parts of himself that had not known love in a long time started to resurface, and we started to work with it and continue to work with it now that he has all of this space after shedding the grief that he had been holding. And so how did we get there? What did we continue doing and what did we start doing? Well, we start at the roots down at the base of this tree with mindfulness. As I said, I wanted to take it slow, and part of taking it slow was to build a safe container for him. So each session, we would start with some mindfulness where I had him envision a safe place for himself to go to touch into anytime he brought up big things. And we would check in with that safe space throughout the changing of the seasons, if he had some celebrations or some really, really big things come up for him. Mantha brought in the use of internal family systems, or as I like to say, good old parts work. We began mapping out all of his parts. And that did lead us to find his grief. But AM had these amazing parts already that were working for him over time, but they were not working together. We identified that he had these parts related to the triple goddess, maiden, mother, and crone, and they would show up for him in different ways. We found his dark goddess that came in when he felt a boundary had been crossed. And we found a part more recently that he calls the handler that would post up and get things done. And this part, the handler, is something that we've been working towards making relationship with. And he's felt lighter since working with it. Now, we just talked about the roots and the trunk of the tree of our work, but the canopy that provided shelter and the safe container was nature. AM has an amazing, gregarious, bubbly personality. And with all of the trauma that he had faced, he felt like he had enough energy to fill up the small room that we would do therapy in at Naropa Community Counseling. And so, before we did our grief ritual, I invited him to do a walking session. We were working with just being and being comfortable with it. And I brought him outside to a small park, and I dared him to try and fill the container of nature, and he couldn't. Thank you. And nature became our place to do our biggest work together. Nature's container is expansive. The front range here is something to behold and can hold us all. And again, when I get to takeaways, I dare you to fill nature up with whatever energy you have, and you're not going to be able to fill it. And so as we kind of get closer and closer to the end of our journey together, I want to reiterate that grief affects everyone and it shouldn't be ignored. The more we ignore it, and in a moment you'll see a quote that if we ignore our grief, it can fester and be brought down through the generations. So I invite you all to be a call to action to start leaning towards your grief rather than away from it. You can help move grief and let go by creating ritual. The other world is already hungry for what you got to give it, but you got to give it. And knowing that creative ritual is for everyone. You can create your own altar. You can create what you need. And you can go and get some good work with some lineage-specific grief work like the ones that Wendy provides. Nature, nature, nature. You can't fill it. It can hold us. It can help us to honor and remember who we are and remember the gifts that we want to take with us from the people and things that we have lost. And finally, community. We don't have to go it alone. You've already heard in Brandy's presentation earlier today, the power of community. I told you all what Wendy said, that community can move mountains, and we can work on decolonizing ourselves and what society says that we have to deal with on our own. Do it with community and be held by the community. I brought my grief with me through all of my journey here at Naropa, and my cohort held it all. My cohort helped to lift me up and to show me what I needed to work on and show me that I am not alone in my grief. And so I will end with a quote by the amazing Martine Prechtel, and that is, grief permeates life and grieving can take many forms, but grief can never be outrun or simply thought away, transcended or meditated into non-existence. Necessary grief, when shunned or unattended, can easily hide for years, even generations, in the skeletal structure of the family collective psyche. Like light, matter, sound, and energy, grief will eventually manifest even among those in the future who do not consciously experience the loss. So please take this as a call to action to lean in and let go. Thank you. We have arrived, though the journey never ends. We can continue to do our own work, and I challenge you to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Creative rituals, grieving and community, that's powerful stuff. Moving into the next piece of powerful stuff, I'd like to welcome Mary Edwina Fuson. Shedding Skins in the Wild, Integrating Psychedelics and Nature-Based Approaches to Trauma. Let's welcome Mary.
Okay. If I want to turn this off and hold on to the thing, how do I do that? Hello, hello. Hello, everybody. How's everybody feeling? Yeah. I just want to take a moment to thank all of my beautiful family and my friends, the family and friends of my lovely cohort members and darling friends for making the trip out here for today's capstone presentation. My name is Mary, and my presentation is called Shedding Skins in the Wild, Integrating Psychedelic and Nature-Based Approaches to Trauma. I want to start in a similar way to Mantha in honoring and acknowledging that this land that we are on today is the unceded territory of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Ute Nations. For the next 25 minutes, I will be taking you on a journey through the new frontiers of therapeutic care. I intend to introduce a new scope of practice for people to help heal severe and complex trauma. This new frontier I refer to is assisted psychedelic therapy, And it has been all the rage in the media as legislation has begun to shift in order to accommodate the necessary care of our own traumatized veterans. It's my intention to expand on this global necessary care, on this global conversation in a way that honors our species' roots and our innate biological need to live in connection with our planet and with each other. Okay. So you've heard a lot today. We've been here since 8. You've heard a lot today about nature-based therapy. And I will explain to you what my why is for nature-based therapy. I personally believe that in healing ourselves and the ecology of the planet, these two things are intrinsically linked, just like the systems that Lala referred to in her presentation. All living organisms on the planet are in some way interconnected. Therefore, humans are naturally capable of living symbiotically with Mother Nature. As many of my cohort members have reminded us today, the environment around us is a powerful example of resilience, making it fertile ground for trauma work. So just a few interesting facts. This right here is an infographic from the United Nations Development of Economic and Social Affairs. These are the 2022 goals for sustainable development. Goal number 15 states that we need to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, manage forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. It's important to note that we are currently facing the largest species extinction since the dinosaur age. Goal number 13 from these same United Nations goals on sustainable development state that we need to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. Medium to large scale natural disasters will increase 40% from 2015 to 2030. And this is an infographic from the World Health Organization, basically just explaining to us that we would be silly to not recognize that there's direct impact on human health, just as our ecological systems start to unravel. Okay, this beautiful woman here is Dr. Janine M. Canty. She is professor here at Naropa University and is a PhD in ecopsychology. She defines ecopsychology as a field that looks at how our society's separation from nature has resulted in widespread human pathology, as well as the current ecological crisis. Janine states in her book, Returning the Self to Nature, that the field of ecopsychology makes 4 major assumptions. The first being the planet is calling for healing. The second is that people are calling for healing. The third is that these two phenomena are intrinsically intertwined. And the fourth, illness is embedded within the history and present of Western civilization. So in the book, Returning the Self to Nature, Janine describes narcissism to be when a person exhibits self-centered behavior, an inflated sense of self that borders on entitlement. In general, it's not a bad thing to have low to moderate levels of narcissism, as it means we have a healthy ego. However, if we look around, looking over here at the symptoms of narcissism, how are we seeing that reflected in our treatment of the environment? And how can reconnecting with nature address our collective narcissism? It's very clear to all of us, especially at this point, that there is widespread mental illness, sadly. Okay, so kind of touching on a topic from the lovely Daphne's presentation, biophilia It's a desire or a tendency to interact or be closely associated with other forms of life in nature. It's also known as a love of life. One of my favorite symptoms of time in nature is the experience, measurable experience of awe. Florence Williams, the author of Nature Fix, describes awe as a discrete event that produces persisting positive changes in attitudes, moods, behavior, presumably in the brain. This is how entranced astronauts described the overview effect when viewing Earth from space. Ultimately, qualities of awe include things that are information rich, things that we consider to be vast, things we have trouble wrapping our minds around, or the ineffable, and they elicit authentic connection, the experience of awe. Our species ultimately is hardwired to spend time in nature, and from nature come a plethora of benefits. Positive awe, curiosity, connection are perfect foundations for navigating trauma. Amanda Sage is actually a local Colorado visionary artist, and we're going to get into the new frontier of psychedelic assisted therapy. So over here, we're looking at the 7 primary drug classifications. We have stimulants, depressants, opioids, classic psychedelics, cannabinoids, dissociatives, and empathogens. So what actually is a psychedelic? And I think there is a lot of confusion around this. So according to the National Institutes of Health, psychedelics are serotonergic hallucinogens, meaning that these molecules bind with the serotonin receptors in the brain. They are powerful psychoactive substances that alter perception and mood and affects numerous cognitive processes. They are generally considered physiologically safe and do not result in dependence or addiction. And this is incredibly important. So much of the prohibition propaganda that we've heard over the last, few decades has told us, you're going to do LSD and you're going to get hooked on it. And that's actually not physically possible. Now, certainly, we can become addicted to behaviors such as gaming, sex, etc. However, chemically speaking, we do not become addicted to psychedelics, classical psychedelics. So there are 3 other classifications of drugs that psychedelic assisted therapy can that fall underneath that umbrella. Dissociatives, specifically ketamine, empathogens, specifically MDMA, and cannabinoids, 2 of the most recognizable ones being THC and CBD. Quick little fun fact about ketamine. It was first synthesized during the war in Vietnam as a combat field anesthesia. It's declared by the World Health Organization as an essential medicine, meaning that if our species were to leave this planet, we would be taking ketamine with us. You only make it onto that list by being extremely safe, really effective, and also really cheap to synthesize. MDMA is a fairly new drug classification, or fairly new drug that falls under the classification of empathogens. This has shown promising and incredible potential with highly traumatized combat veterans due to its heart-opening and connective nature. And lastly, we have the cannabinoids. Scientists have found between 80 and 100 cannabinoids in cannabis sativa plants. The human brain itself contains specific cannabinoid receptors that are designed to bind only with cannabinoids. The discovery of this is incredible because what that implies is our species, Homo sapiens, have evolved next to this plant so much so for tens of thousands of years that our brains are literally changed to support information from that plant. So here's a quick little overview of psychedelics, the classical psychedelics. And And you'll see listed there in the green, these are synthesized in labs and the rest occur naturally in nature. DMT has been discovered to naturally occur in many different plant and animal species. And neurologists have found it in our very own human brains produced by our pineal gland. This molecule is commonly known as the spirit molecule. So I think it's really important to talk about the human, like a brief history of human engagement with these plant medicines. I'm going to bring your attention over here to this infographic from Big Think. Right here, you have this little teeny tiny red sliver. That is prohibition. So far that we can tell, all the way back to 4000 BCE, our species has been interacting with plant psychedelic medicines. This character over here is the Tassali near Ajir cave painting of Algeria. This image dates back after being carbon dated to 4000 BCE, found in northern Africa in a cave in Algeria. Many people know this image to be the mushroom shaman, and you see little psilocybin mushrooms growing all over his body. Down here is one of the mummies that was extracted recently in southern Peru, and after testing the hair of these 22 mummies, they have found evidence of San Pedro cactus, a source of mescaline, and the psychoactive plants that make up the drug ayahuasca. So it's also incredibly important for me to touch upon the contraindications of engaging with psychedelics. Just like anything, there is no one size fits all, nor is psychedelic plant medicine a fix-all Band-Aid for all things. You still have to do your work. Some of the disorders, psychological disorders that would fall under, a consideration of potential danger would be just psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, some mood disorders such as bipolar disorder, that includes psychotic symptoms. There are many therapists that believe that in some instances of personality disorders, this could be dangerous, not necessarily to the client, but to the therapeutic relationship. Some physiological contraindications include pregnancy, history of epilepsy and seizure disorders, and severe cardiovascular disease. Some of the recommended, so in order to kind of test your clients, obviously, you want to try to get a feel for who they are. You want to establish a therapeutic relationship, develop rapport. But some of the recommended screening assessments are listed above the dotted line there. We want to definitely screen for physiological contraindications as well as psychological. The dissociative experience scale is also an important one to consider because it tests our levels of disassociation. And again, like narcissism, disassociation is healthy to a degree. Everything below the dotted line here is assessments that will measure the amount of impact that the psychedelic plant medicine experience had on the client. Okay, so as Mantha so beautifully presented in their recent presentation, I'm going to discuss the importance of decolonizing Western psychology's approach to psychedelic assisted therapy. These are incredibly important considerations for avoiding appropriation of Indigenous cultures. It is essential that we include the voices of Indigenous elders in the policymaking around these plants. We need to increase accessibility to this form of therapeutic care, because the direction it seems to be going in right now is people are going to be priced out of their own medicines. Not today. Okay, we need to enforce ecological protection around these sacred plant medicines and animal species. The United States has definitely they've done a little bit to try to oversee that peyote mescaline cactus isn't harvested unless you are an Indigenous person living within the communities practicing peyote ceremonies. However, it does not stop people from running out into this northern desert and plucking up little peyote buttons. The same with the different frog species. Lastly, we need to honor the wisdom, practices, and traditions of the Indigenous groups that have been working with these plant medicines and entheogens for thousands of years. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So we as a Western society need to trust that Indigenous groups who have been working with these sacred medicines for generations know how to approach these altered states of consciousness with reverence, safety, and respect. I don't know what that thing is. Okay, whatever. Okay, so this is an image many of you have probably seen. It's a visionary painting created by Alex Gray called St. Albert and the LSD Revolution. So I would be remiss not to name some of the early pioneers that worked with these psychedelic medicines therapeutically. So Albert Hofmann is the famous Swiss chemist who took the infamous bicycle ride after accidentally ingesting LSD through his skin on April 19th, 1943, effectively having the world's first ever LSD trip. Some of the other early pioneers in psychedelic assisted therapy include Dr. Humphrey Osmond, Dr. Christina Groff, Dr. Stanislav Groff, her husband, Dr. Charles Gobb, who was first to work therapeutically with MDMA, and of course, the famous ethnobotanist Terence McKenna. And down here in the lower right-hand images, you have Christina and Stanislav Groff, who have also pioneered the holotropic breathwork system. Okay, so before we get into my clinical case study, we should talk about the experience of altered states of consciousness, sometimes also known as expanded states of consciousness, and what its therapeutic potential is. For starters, it increases psychological flexibility, increases insight and acceptance, elicits a renewed sense of wonder. Walls are able to come down, allowing for a greater sense of openness to new experiences, and it renews a sense of connection with nature and others that trauma so often severs. Okay. Yep. So my case study. I have been working at Gateway Domestic Violence Shelter now for the last almost year. I will describe my client for confidentiality purposes. We'll call her May. She is a 23-year-old cis female client who is a survivor of long-term domestic abuse and violence. She identifies as queer and has been separated from her husband since September of 2023. In addition to a diagnosis of PTSD and generalized anxiety disorder, her symptoms also reveal, her history and symptoms also reveal the existence of CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is all due to long-term early childhood trauma. Due to my limitations around utilization of psychedelic medicines, I've decided to do Jungian dream work with this client. Dreams are an expanded state of consciousness that allow us to access our unconscious, that which we've kind of pushed down because we either don't want to look at it or what have you. This particular client has personal experience with psychedelics, and I believe her to be an appropriate candidate for assisted psychedelic therapy. So why dream work, you ask? May was experiencing common symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder in the form of regularly occurring traumatic memory-oriented nightmares around her abuse. These nightmares almost always took the form of common escape scenes. Dream work allowed her to view the traumatic experience from a different perspective, while also allowing her to access repressed aspects of her psyche's shadow. So what this looked like is she would start by writing the dream out in narrative form using present tense. She would then bring the dream to therapy, and she would identify how each character could possibly represent repressed aspects of herself, similar to IFS parts work. And then finally, she would engage in Jungian active imagination activity, where she would dream the dream forward and imagine correcting the pattern that had been interrupted by the traumatic event. So here we are at the synthesization of my presentation. I want to propose an idea for moving away from this four-walled clinical talk therapy model. And I want to take psychedelic therapy outside. Our early ancestors conducted their own ceremonies outside in nature. How can we incorporate nature as a facilitator of therapy alongside of plant medicines? So there's a wonderful therapist that has become a friend of mine. Her name is Aaliyah Littleton, and she has a beautiful psychedelic and nature-based practice called Wild and Wonderful Life. Yeah. And she brought up some really good points in a conversation with me about what substances were somewhat limiting in terms of nature just due to safety concerns. For example, like ketamine, it's very simple. It's an anesthetic, right? So you're going to get the wobbles. There's going to be trip issues. Like you don't want anybody to break a tooth. It's not good. Also, it's important for nurse practitioners and medical personnel to keep an eye on people's vital signs, etc. Some other drugs that could potentially fall under that category are ibogaine, a psychedelic root that comes out of West Africa, and MDMA. But I'm kind of the personal belief that you can take MDMA pretty much anywhere. Psychedelics that work well outside and often are used in ceremony outside are, of course, ayahuasca, psilocybin mushrooms, cannabis, peyote, and LSD. Now, we have to talk about set and setting. So imagine the set being what's going on in here, and the development of rapport within the therapeutic relationship is what paves the way for security within the set. Your setting is your environment. One of the best ways to, as a therapist, to really ensure a container is created, a container of safety, is by the therapist's intention to create a sacred and reverent container with the introduction of ritual and ceremony. And as Chris so beautifully described the ceremony, as well as Catherine, so many of us have talked about ritual and ceremony. This can actually help create safety for the client who is going into this altered state of consciousness. In the secular Western world we live in today, this could potentially be your client's first ever experience with ritual and/or ceremony. Okay. And now we're kind of getting close to the end. The importance of integration. JC had a wonderful presentation on this, which is going to make this really easy for me. Okay. Many people within this field of work describe the importance of integration by saying it's as important, if not more important, than the psychedelic experience itself. Because otherwise, we're just doing drugs. So Daniel McQueen, who is also an LPC and graduate of Naropa University with a practice here in Boulder called Center for Medicinal Mindfulness, says that the root word of integration is entire. It's defined as the restoration to wholeness, the process of renewal, the making up of a whole by combining the separate parts or elements. Terrence McKenna has an incredible quote. The psychedelic inner astronaut sees things in which no other human being has ever seen before or will ever see again, but in fact has no meaning unless it is possible to carry into the collectivity. Yeah. So nature is an incredible container for integration. The wonderful therapist that I just named, Aaliyah Littleton, has a monthly psychedelic integration group process that takes place outside. They do walk and talks and that sort of thing. So some other beneficial integration methods include creative writing, personal narrative work, Jungian active imagination, creative visual art for ineffable experience, somatic expression, such as dance, yoga, tai chi, and swimming, nature walks, meditation, and mindfulness. And over here, Allison McQueen is the wife of Daniel McQueen and has these 7 steps of integration. I have no idea why that thing is still on the screen. Sorry, guys. So in closing, I would like to leave you with this. This is a poem that I wrote while I was on my rites of passage trip doing my solo. I bled into the mother and she bled into me. I wept tears into her red soil and she wept rain onto the dry land. My heart burst open with gratitude and her flowers bloomed in the desert. My ancestors and guides carried me to rest and her gentle breeze ruffled the juniper branches. I dug my toes into the warm earth and she cloaked me in her sparkling dust. After the birds serenaded the daylight, the crickets ushered in the night. My body sought comforting warmth, and grandfather fire's flames danced on the walls of the womb. My breath became quiet and calm, while the stars twinkled in one by one. My heart is happy here in my womb home, as I'm held lovingly by my mother. Thank you so much.
Held by my womb home. Just let that sink in. Thank you, Mary. Rays of light illuminating an accessible, sustainable path forward to nature-based therapy. Please welcome Zofia, Lemise.
There's too many LaCroix up here. Oops. There we go. I thought karma was supposed to work the other way around. Okay. I can't see my screen at all. So hold on. Woo. Oh, that's so weird. Oh, okay. It's the one laptop touching the other. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Zofia Lemise, and I'm here to illuminate an accessible, sustainable path forward for nature-based therapy. So first, we're going to talk about what is nature-based therapy and what is wilderness therapy, and why should you care about it? Next, we're going to talk about my insights I gleaned from working in the field of wilderness therapy. Then I'm going to illuminate the path forward with my recommendations for nature-based therapy. And finally, we'll tie it all together with a nice little bow with my vision for a nature-based healing collective. So first, I have a couple questions for you. What words do you associate with wilderness therapy? Shout it out. All right. And what about nature-based therapy? Awesome. Thank you all. So I'm hearing some similarities and some differences, and also a note about Paris Hilton, and I will cover that in a moment. So let's talk about what I'm going to define nature-based and wilderness therapy as. So I'm going to define nature-based therapy as any therapeutic intervention that involves using nature in some way. And so many of my classmates have beautifully illustrated this in their presentations today. And I'm going to define wilderness therapy as a specific subset of nature-based therapy and specific intervention that involves taking clients out of their homes, usually adolescents, and usually as a last resort, to live outside in the wilderness for an extended period of time and work on improving their mental health. So if you were here this morning, you heard Kaylin talk a little bit about this, but wilderness therapy has remained largely inaccessible to most people due to its high cost of attendance that's not covered by insurance. Additionally, we heard a shout out about Paris Hilton, which leads me to talk about the fact that throughout the history of wilderness therapy, it's been under scrutiny for the nefarious actions of harmful players that have existed in the industry. And this has been exacerbated by movements and by documentaries like Paris Hilton's Breaking Code Silence and Hell Camp. There has been a lot of harm done in the industry by some harmful players. However, there's also been so much good. So many students graduate saying, this wilderness therapy program, Open Sky, where I completed my internship, Open Sky saved my life. And I saw personally firsthand during my internship the transformative power of wilderness and nature-based therapy. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you all about my ideas for working with the field of nature-based therapy to create a field that can sustain the ebbs and flows of the market so that we can share the healing power of nature with the most amount of people for the longest period of time. So I'd like to start us first on talking about the research behind nature-based therapy. And if you've been listening to the other presentations, my classmates have done part of this job for me and shown you a lot of research behind many different interventions. And there's so much more research. If you want to know more, my annotated bibliography is in my handout with more sources. However, I want to highlight one specific practice, which has been introduced by the Japanese people, called forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku. And I want to talk about this practice a little bit because it's something that can be very accessible to people, since it involves mindfully walking through the forest. And even though it's pretty simple, or can be pretty simple, it can create some drastic positive mental and physical health benefits. For example, alleviating stress, anxiety, and depression, as well as lowering heart rate, as well as just promoting happiness and reducing fatigue. So we've talked about the research behind nature-based therapy, but what does this look like in the field? I'm going to talk to you all specifically about my experience in my internship working in the field of wilderness therapy. So for my internship, I worked at Open Sky Wilderness Therapy alongside Clement, who presented so beautifully of some of the interventions and learnings and teachings that happened at Open Sky. So in my opinion, Open Sky was the quintessential wilderness therapy experience. It was holistic and family-centered. It took adolescents and young adults who lived outside in teams of their peers for about a period of 3 months, where they progressed through stages based on the medicine wheel, which is present in many indigenous cultures. And I will talk about this a little bit later. So as a guide, I worked at Open Sky in 2022, and then I returned to complete my internship in family services, facilitating family quests and graduations. And this picture is from our graduation tent in Utah. And so for Family Quest, families would have the opportunity to visit their child at Open Sky and camp out with them while doing a 3-day family therapy intensive. It was a lot of work. So oftentimes, to kick off the family quests, I would talk to the families about what I'll call the bullseye of growth, in which this diagram I've created here. So in the center, we have the comfort zone, where students and families, or anyone really, is feeling both psychologically and physically, also spiritually and mentally relaxed. You're in the zone. You're maybe reading a book, curled up on the couch by the fire. And then the challenge zone is outside of the comfort zone. And this is where we step out of our comfort zone, push our edges in order to grow. And then you see this white ring on the outside. And this denotes the area with which we can make positive, effective therapeutic growth and change. Because outside of this area is beyond capacity. And this means that things could happen like shutdown, meltdown, rage. And this is not a place we want to be to make any therapeutic change, because it can't happen here. People are stuck in their fight or flight reaction, unable to grow in that moment. And so during Family Quest, we talk to the families about helping them to expand their comfort zone so that they have more tolerance for uncomfortableness by helping them step into their challenge zone and then retreating back to their comfort zone, pendulating back and forth so that they can expand. So, So I'd like to introduce you to the Smith family, and names have been changed for privacy. So the daughter, Emily, 13 years old, adopted, transgender, girl diagnosed with depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, parent-child relational disorder, developmental coordination disorder, unspecified neurocognitive disorder, and gender dysphoria. And Mantha mentioned this earlier, and I'd just like to also mention that the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is something that individuals who are transgender or genderqueer need to receive so that they can receive gender-affirming healthcare. I'm also mentioning all of these diagnoses to show to you that there's a wide range of individuals that can be supported through nature-based and wilderness therapy. And then Sally, Emily's mom, in her early 50s, cisgender, single mom, successful in her career, yet really struggled with attuning to herself and her daughter, and had struggled as well with parenting skills, and also depression and anxiety as well. And I'd also like to note that Emily and Sally were both different races. So much of Emily's day-to-day life was spent with a nanny, actually, and not her mother. And when the two of them did get together, Emily and Sally, there'd often be conflict, which was usually verbal, but could sometimes turn physical. So how did we work with them? So I'm going to talk to you about some interventions we used with this family that we also use with many other families. So the first is the 4 Rs. This is the meat of the therapeutic work at Open Sky Family Quest. And this is when families talk about their regrets, resentments, respects, and requests with each other, and then they reflect them in the container of therapeutic groups, which is that challenge zone. I'm looking at you, family. Maybe we'll do this sometime. And so with this family, with the Smith family, they struggled with attunement. So for the group about requests, towards the end, we had them guess each other's requests. And they ended up guessing correctly, which really helped them build a feeling of being able to attune with each other. So the next skill was mindfulness, because as maybe my family might be thinking, it could be really stressful to talk about the 4 Rs with each other. So we would help families step back into that comfort zone with mindfulness activities like yoga, meditation, and hiking. And with this particular family, the Smith family, in between some heavy groups, I facilitated a yoga session for them to come back to their bodies. There was also unstructured downtime, because sometimes you just don't want to do anything and you want to chill and have surface level conversations to connect with your family. And this can build connection and strengthen bonds. Observation was an awesome part of Family Quest, and it allowed us to observe the families interacting with each other in real time. And this was great because it allowed us to provide more accurate counseling. So in the case of the Smith family, we were able to notice that Sally would micromanage Emily to the point of conflict. And so at one point towards the end of the Family Quest, we pulled her aside and said, "Sally, I think it's important for you to connect before you correct." And finally, probably the most exciting part of wilderness and nature-based therapy is improvisation. And this meant that we could create tailored interventions that made sense for that specific family at that specific time. And this looked like things such as family sculpting, where you have one family member take the other family members and physically put them in places that represent something like the dynamic of their family. Another intervention was just allowing families to cook together and see what happened. And the micromanaging piece came up a lot with the Smith family, and we did talk about that with them. But yeah, it just allowed us to really see into what was going on with the family. So from my perspective, these family quests really offered families the opportunity to get things on the table, work through them, and also connect with each other in ways that they might not have done before, so that they can improve their communication and improve their dynamics. So I would be remiss without acknowledging some of the controversial topics in the field of wilderness therapy. So first is that these programs, as I mentioned before, cost a lot. They cost over $50,000. And so what's ironic is that they also can tend to appropriate from indigenous cultures. Like I mentioned, the medicine wheel earlier, and there's other examples that I don't have time to cover. But it's ironic because they have a tendency to appropriate these cultural concepts and yet remain financially inaccessible to many folks, including some indigenous and minority communities. Further, Kaylin talked about gooning, and I'll say it again. Gooning is a practice where families, parents don't feel like they can get their child to wilderness therapy themselves. So they hire an outside company to, not for lack of better words, this is the word, to kidnap their children and bring them against their will to a wilderness therapy program. And yeah, this causes trauma and resentment, and is not okay. And finally, participants have to be able-bodied in order to be admitted. And this means it leaves out a lot of people that could really benefit from wilderness or nature-based therapies if they were just made accessible to them. So with that being said, I felt like Open Sky was an incredible program that offered an incredible experience, an incredible transformative experience to its clients. So as you can see here, this is research Open Sky conducted on their graduates throughout the 18 years they were in existence. And so when students came into the program, they averaged a score of behavioral dysfunction akin to someone who was experiencing treatment in an inpatient setting, like in a mental institution. And then by the time they graduated, and up to 12 months later, their score dropped down very significantly to the range of community normal functioning. And this is incredible. This is a huge difference, and it's sustained throughout a year, and maybe even more. Have to do more research. There is some research on after up to 18 months after. So what made Open Sky so effective in the first place? Here's my thoughts. So first is empowerment. And Kaylin also talked about this too. I guess you're getting sick of me calling you out, but so Open Sky really empowered students to take responsibility for themselves and to take responsibility for their actions, their behaviors, and for their personal health and well-being. Open Sky was also a family-centered experience, as I mentioned earlier, talking about Family Quest and other ways that we involved families. And this is really important because research shows that there's a huge change in a positive change in effectiveness of treatment for adolescents when their family is involved. Next is the concept of togetherness. So guides would live outside with students for 1 to 2 weeks, and therapists would meet the students outside. And families, as I mentioned, would come and experience the wilderness with their child. And this really fostered a connection, like we're all in this together, we're all being outside and in the elements together, and I'm not alone. I also see Open Sky in itself as a rite of passage for young people because of its ability to help the participants take a step out of their life and really focus on building their self-efficacy, soul connection, as well as transformation. Creativity, as I mentioned earlier, and improvisation was so special to the wilderness therapy experience. Some of the greatest interventions came from therapists, guides, and students that were just created on the fly. And finally, nature in itself heals. Can you imagine how much healing you would have from throwing it all away and living in the wilderness for 3 months? There's a lot of health benefits mentally and physically to this. So we know about the benefits of nature-based therapy and my experience working at Open Sky. So how can we move it forward? How can we move forward to build a sustainable path so that we can share nature-based therapy with the most amount of people. So first, it's got to be affordable. So if a program, or let's say an individual looking to create a wilderness nature-based program, is interested in having it be residential, the first step is to find financial support. Have a sliding scale, have scholarships, or become a nonprofit like Inner Roads in Montana. Or finally, most importantly, I believe, is create a program that will get insurance approval from the start. And then there's also the opportunity to not be residential and help clients save a lot of money by not living there. For example, creating a nature-based intensive outpatient program or having weekly therapeutic groups that are nature-based. And then retreats can also offer a kind of mini glimpse into what it might look like to live in the wilderness for a period of, say, 3 to 10 days. For example, something like a standalone family quest or a rites of passage journey, as many of my classmates have talked about today. And finally, you can just keep it simple. You, as a therapist, you can offer your clients the opportunity to just walk and talk outside during therapy. My own therapist walks alongside a lake with me, and it's great. And yeah, so just because it's affordable does not mean it's going to be accessible. We have to go further. And this path does not actually lie up in the clouds. It's very realistic. So first, we have to be adaptable. And this means asking clients what accommodations they need and changing plans or getting the equipment needed to meet those accommodations. Next is getting curious about your client's relationship with nature. Because for some, nature can be a place of fear and anxiety based on their personal or cultural history and beliefs and experiences. And then consider what defines nature in the first place. Couldn't nature-based therapy be meeting for therapy in the middle of a park, in the middle of a traffic circle, in the middle of downtown DC? Or meeting at the riverbed? Or even watching a sunset from a balcony together? And finally, outside in itself is optional. Daphne gave beautiful examples about how to do this in a jail. And also, other options can include bringing animals, plants inside for therapy, or even weaving in metaphors, as Lala talked about in her presentation. So I've offered some suggestions, and now I want to share with you this diagram I created to help both therapists and clients figure out how they want to incorporate nature in their therapy. So the first decision is figuring out, do I want nature to actively shape this experience, or do I want nature to provide a supportive and grounded presence? And if it's the latter, you can consider interventions like, as I just mentioned, nature as metaphor or nature-based meditations. And then if it's the former, you have to make the next choice, which is deciding the level of intensity. So how much time, intensity, and effort do you want to put into this intervention? So if it's a high level of intensity, this can be something like residential wilderness therapy treatment, or as Mary just talked about, psychedelic assisted therapy. And if it's a low level of intensity, you can offer things like horticultural therapy groups, like Brandy talked about earlier, or animal assisted therapy, like Michael talked about. So I hope that this diagram is helpful to anyone who's interested in using it and incorporating nature in their practice. Okay, so finally, to tie it all together, I'm now going to share with you my vision for Rays of Light, a nature-based healing collective situated on over 25 acres of Colorado countryside with staff ranging from therapists to yoga instructors to nutritionists, and also an opportunity for outside practitioners to rent out space to use with their own clients. Rays of Light Healing Collective will have a main building and then other buildings for guests so that people can have more long-term, not residential, but like retreat type stuff, or also have indoor options for therapy. Some of the offerings at this healing collective include retreats and expeditions, both on and off site. So this could include things like rite of passage journeys, or a mindfulness focused backpacking trip. Counseling will also be available, such as individual, couples, and family, and there'll be the opportunity to incorporate nature-based concepts and nature-based therapies that make sense based on the specific clients present. And then group programs also may be offered, such as weekly horticultural therapy groups for adolescent girls, or a working with tending your emotions, maybe, as Katie mentioned, learning how to work with emotions in a therapeutic group. And finally, there'll also be options for holistic healing outside of just therapy, such as yoga classes and nutrition courses. So while I hope to make this a reality in the future, and I hope that each of you gets to experience it, in conclusion, I want to leave you with a few final takeaways. Worldwide research confirms the effectiveness of nature-based therapy in improving mental health outcomes. Nature-based therapy helps families strengthen their bonds and improve their communication in an experience that has reduced distractions and more opportunities for shared experiences. Nature-based therapy is more than just wilderness adventures. It can be made accessible and affordable to all those who are interested, so that in comparison to wilderness therapy, it can sustain the ebbs and flows of the market, so that we can share it with the most people as possible. And finally, we evolved in nature. And separated and disconnected from our roots, we've been suffering mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And I believe that nature-based therapy can help us to reconnect with nature and our souls so that we can create an internal and external world that we're proud to live in. So my ask for you, or my call to action, is simply to spread the word about nature-based therapy. This is through your organizations, your institutions, if you work in an institution, if you interact with health insurance companies, and just share the research behind nature-based therapy so that we can share this awesome intervention with so many different ways to use it with the most people possible, in places like high schools, elder care facilities, people who are incarcerated, or youth group homes. So, thank you.
Thank you, Zofia. A supportive and grounded presence.
Because it's process.
That is nature. I'm excited about the Rays of Light Collective. We have two more presentations. Let's bring to the stage our presenter for therapeutic transformation through lineage-specific rites of passage, an integration of ancestral rituals and psychotherapy by Delany.
Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Wow, we made it almost to the end. This is a long day. Thanks for still being here. How do I get this up here? How do I add this to this deal? Katie's? Oh, really? Yeah. I got.
Oh.
No.
Yeah, but we ended up presenting them.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh. It's not the audio. And where's the other? Sorry. Okay, so this is yours, huh?
This is Katie's.
Which one is yours?
This one.
Okay.
The present. Oh my gosh. Yeah, dude. All right, I'll talk at double speed now. Let's rock and roll. Cool. Sweet. Welcome. Thank you. First I want to thank my infinitely loving and supportive family for flying all the way from Maryland today. Come support me. Especially my incredibly smart, beautiful, and very pregnant sister. Yay for new niece on the way. I also want to thank everyone who sat through this is the work of these budding masters of cultivating and embodied human experience. These presentations have been insane. Like for everyone that's been here all day, these are some really powerful and super prestigious pieces of work. So pat yourself on the back. I'm really stoked to be able to build on the great work of my cohort who share similar passions and have presented on similar themes of human development. I just want to start by disclosing that I am a student first and forever. I exist in a body representing a power structure that has resolved the rawest of our human connection, natural development, and flourishing. I'm here to build a bridge and make a heart-forward attempt at bridging our disconnection with my privilege, learning, and intrinsic love for humans and the earth. Lastly, take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm still learning. I don't know what I don't know, but I'm trying. So thank you for listening, having an open heart and mind, and attempting engagement. So here we go. With the rush of life, we barely pause from one event to the next. The value of pausing and giving ourselves a moment to reflect, move, shake, and integrate what came last so that we may step into our next experience more embodied, prepared, and secure. So whoever is able and willing will get up and jiggle around for a second, shake off this long day. If it suits your needs to sit and groove, get vocal, or take your cue to go to the restroom, there is space for everyone. I can't really dance right now, so please dance for me. Yeah, there we go. Yes. Okay, now sit down and be quiet. Thank you. Hope that helped. Woo, certainly helped me. All right, so what are we talking about today? During this presentation, we're going to discuss what rituals, ceremony, and rites of passage are. Thankfully, everyone today, or at least most people, have talked about it. So this is going to make, again, my job super easy. It's really awesome that we all have similar passions. And like, I think for people that aren't part of this program and don't know this world, hopefully all these kind of intersecting themes really help you like drive home these points and take them with you. So you kind of have some type of competence to leave here to bring into your communities and for your personal life. And I want to highlight the populations who may benefit this, highlighting where we can practice these and how to create authentic practices that connect to our lineages, culture, and importantly, just discuss why even bother with this. So all of this talk of ritual, ceremony, and rites of passage. What is all of this woo-woo stuff anyways? I guess that's the Naropa way. Cultures around the world have been utilizing these practices since culture has existed. They have served as a way for people to actualize all the stages of human development. Clement highlighted one of my favorite authors, Bill Plotkin, who also, I think, came here and has, in my opinion, the best model of human development that is out there to use for a therapist. I highly recommend reading Nature and the Human Soul. Rites of passage and all these practices bring ritual to create habit and participation with activities that provide growth, inspire inner child, and creative gifts we all came into this world with. They design pathways to personal health and cultivate healthy, mutual loving, and beneficial community. And based on millennia of indigenous history and personal experience, this all assists us in remaining or reconnecting with the magic of the earth, the source of our creation, and a desire to care for the places and beings our feet walk. So who is this good for? I think, and I believe that everyone that is a human can and would benefit from these practices. I do also believe that, especially for us therapists, there are a few categories of humans that have a particularly fruitful experience through utilizing this while in a therapeutic relationship. My experience exploring indigenous practices and culture has been 20 plus years in the making. I'm still such an infant in my discovery and clarity in how to authentically assimilate this into my life. But my journey began at a wilderness program in Utah at 17 called Walkabout that forever changed my life. So screw those stupid films. I did my first full Lakota sweat lodge, busted a coal with a bow and hand drill set, experienced multiple rites of passage and ceremony experiences. I even had the opportunity to create a ceremony for my cohort at this program, inspired by two pivotal books from my adolescence that are here. The Tao of Pooh, which is a really awesome book using stories of Winnie the Pooh to help you understand, for us simpletons, what the Tao Te Ching is saying. And then the other is Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I highly recommend both. Over the decades, I've experimented with different spiritual communities that primarily utilize Native American practices. I struggled feeling like authentic, felt out of place, and would rarely find myself surrounded by leaders or participants who seemed to be doing anything more than appropriating. So for a while, I stepped away so I could reflect on a different pathway I could take for myself, and if successful, utilize with my therapy clients. I decided to learn about my lineage through programs like Ancestry.com. From there, I could investigate the practices of my Irish heritage, who happen to do their own version of sweat lodges and have a rich culture of folk medicine, which I discovered during a horticulture therapy class project with Heather, which was really cool and enlightening. Research shows we've all been negatively impacted by our physical, mental, and spiritual disconnection from Mother Nature and the cosmos. And also, I believe that these populations we're discussing here experience the disconnection and symptoms that come with it at a more extreme level. The two youth categories are left without proper mentorship and authentic and meaningful rites of passage to transition to these next stages, which are vital in our ability to become adult, like giving people in our communities. The queer, neurodivergent, persons with a disability, and BIPOC communities have been oppressed, abused, traumatized, and restricted from belonging to the whole of this earth forever. Furthermore, I believe any trauma victim will have alterations in their ability to access normal functions of the brain, and specifically limbic systems, connecting safely with their body, affecting gut and nervous system. And as a result, they also lose connection to spirituality, meaning, purpose, and any sense of self-worth. So I wanted to talk a minute about a client that I've been working with for the past, about 9 months. They were one of my first 3 clients. I've been interning at a group practice in Arvada, Colorado called Alpine Lakes Counseling Center for the past 9 months. I found a lot of connection and enrichment working with a really diverse population that has included every race of human people in the queer community, cis, heterosexual women and men, and all have been positively impacted by being introduced to and some investigating and creating these practices for themselves. Harry is one of my longest held and consistent clients that I believe has experienced the significant benefits from our work in therapy and these practices. Harry was assigned, and their pronouns are he, him, assigned female at birth, and 4 years ago made the deeply sacred and personal decision to transition. He's been impacted by abusive parents his entire life and faced overt attacks and abuse from strangers and familiars in life. He has experienced severe depression, anxiety, and anger issues as a result that have impacted his ability to feel embodied and establish an authentic personal identity. Further downstream symptoms have included strained relationships, fear of being in any public space, work and school life, and a general sense of doom. I think we can all relate to that these times. Shit is crazy. Our work together, learning and experimenting with these ways has helped manufacture a sense of confidence and clarity through journaling and mindfulness exercises. We've been able to process grief through a cord cutting ceremony to let go of anger and hate and a relationship at all with parents that he has decided he can no longer have. And furthermore, these practices have helped him heal from acute PTSD to doing ROP work with conjunction with internal family systems, which you've heard from today, where we were able to work with these individual parts and do a rite of passage for each individual part to help them move on through those steps, as Mantha so gracefully enlightened us on earlier today. The work is never over, but they continue to engage in the process by creating a new blueprint for themselves with tools and a new positive cognitive and somatic memory for themselves. Today, he can say that he knows who they are and exclaim it with freaking pride. They have learned to befriend their anger and process it in a more healthy way. He has felt like he can be more comfortably in the driver's seat of his life and has majorly reduced his experience with depression and anxiety. My dear friend Brandy, sitting right there that you got to hear from today, who introduced me to these 3 books, Over the past years, beginning while we used to work at the climbing gym together, opening behind the desk and having existential and philosophical conversations all day until we discovered we're both applying to this program. Anyways, I felt it important to highlight these resources. They've been profoundly informative for me in giving language, history, and evidence to the ways Western society has pulled us away from existing and communing with our human experience. This reality is a driving force in my journey into this field. And unfortunately, it is also, I guess, also really cool for stability for us, but a major factor in our industry continuing to expand. I've shared these books with a lot of people that are not in this world. I think it's a really great, they're a really great way, if you're not in this world, to read something that's got easy language, has an entertaining narrative, and has like each book, the amount of time that he spends to communicate with people all over the world and really immerse himself in the subject. The first one is kind of like the best piece of work on the war on drugs, as well as explaining the experience of both the addict, the people that are affected by it, drug dealers, and the feds, all around that. The next one deals with 9 different ways that we've lost connection with our humanity and the earth, and what he posits can help. And the last one is how we've lost our focus due to social media, technology, and busyness and hustle of capitalism, and how we can kind of work with that. So super light reading. In undergrad, I first took deep ecology and ecopsychology classes from Janine Canty, who used to be a huge teacher here. She's a huge inspiration to me, and the literature and work that I did in those classes is a huge reason I'm here. I'm really inspired by the work of cellist Glendenning in her book, My Name is Cellist, and I'm in Recovery from Western Civilization. It goes into kind of like the ideas, if you've ever read the book Ishmael or other topics that discuss what the totalitarian agricultural revolution has done to our society, and the shift in how we existed as humans changed from that point on. That was the point where, surplus of food first became a thing, and we had to create different gender roles to protect food, take care of the house, and go out and do a lot of different things that created a hierarchy structure that wasn't a part of our life, at least since this ice age. We can talk about what happened before if you want to talk about aliens and other stuff in another conversation. She discusses what is best highlighted by this quote here that I hope you can read. And I also wanted to read another one that states, most pointedly, nature-based people manifest the very qualities that contemporary psychotherapy, the recovery movement, and spiritual practices continually aim for: a visible sense of inner peace, unself-conscious humility, and an urge to communal cooperation, and heartfelt appreciation for the world around them. So, what is the value of, connecting with ancestors, diving into our family history and our lineage? This is heavy stuff. It's rare that I meet people today that come from some perfect family system with 10 generations of stellar, amazing, like shaman-like people, because, like I said, we've all been living under the thumb of massive empire capitalism and stuff. But about 2 falls ago, we did a program in our cultural considerations in a wilderness setting class using genograms. This is a tool for therapists to work a lot with couples, but really for anyone that want to get a better idea of how their whole family tree has impacted them based on generational markers. It's kind of like doing ancestry, but it goes 10 times further, where it includes symbols that you can't really read here, but it's just like markers for, was there divorce, suicides, mental health? Are there tons of heart issues, addiction? Is there hidden secrets in the family? Are there, the list goes on. Anything you could ever think about, positive or negative, there's a list and a legend that you can create to give you a blueprint, so you can kind of figure out, just like taking personality tests or attachment theory tests, a little guideline to kind of work with what may be going on to inspire and inform your current experience. Just like everything else is not a silver bullet, but I think it is a helpful tool. You know, we can learn a lot from our ancestors and our lineage. We might have a lineage of warriors or of healers, of royalty and of slavery. Most family lines will have both good and bad, both light and shadow, both lover and perpetrator or destroyer. Sometimes for these reasons, it can be scary. You consider turning over the rocks of your family tree and to see what might be there. Know that statistically speaking, we all have bad guys in our family history. This doesn't say anything about you or who you are now. You have the power to create your own story and break free from any pain created or caused in the past. You are your own person. It is okay to be mindful though. And the more we know about our lineage, the more comfortable we can feel working with our ancestors. Yeah, like, so I know it can be a daunting experience and it should be handled with care. And if you're utilizing it with clients, you know, there really needs to be some careful steps to make sure that this is safe for them, because some trauma, like I forget who was talking about it earlier, you know, people can rip the Band-Aids off their arm, I think it was Chris, and have nothing in place to kind of hold all the blood and goo coming out from that wound. And so again, just like every intervention that we use in the therapy rooms, just be careful and investigate first before executing, and ask questions. Make sure that they're safe with it, because it could unearth long buried trauma and cause acute PTSD symptoms to come about. With that, I still believe that when we're in the window of tolerance, this is worthy. That's why we're in therapy. That's what growth is. We have to take chances, face hard truths, get uncomfortable. But, you know, ancestral healing and intergenerational trauma, and how this impacts family lineages over time. You know, healing seeks to understand these past family traumas and how they may be impacting the person or their family today. Ancestral healing requires us to take a deep look at the patterns that have shown up in our family over time as a result of past traumas, and consciously work with ending hurtful behaviors and creating new, more compassionate or healthy patterns. This is super courageous work, but it's not always easy to do actively with family that is still alive. It can require having a lot of clear boundaries, even if current family is very challenging for you. So like other people have talked about before, you know, access to the good things in life, to beautiful, lush nature settings, to, you know, fancy resources and healthy food, good clothes, shelter. It's not a part of everyone's human experience. You know, we're lucky enough to live in Boulder, Colorado. This is the freaking most privileged place in the country, almost, you know, and, you know, so just keeping that in mind, you know, but what is our access and our experience with the environment we were born into? You know, how can we utilize whatever space we become aware of in our surroundings to connect to these practices? I was recently gifted this magic deck of cards from my wonderful rock star of a partner who happens to also be a stellar and masterful love-forward therapist. And in order to use them with myself and clients working with dysregulation. These are just a few examples of fun, or I don't want to say fun, but cool little rituals that, you know, can soothe the dysregulation of your nervous system with simple, more broadly accessible practices that can be done in the little windows of time in our busy lives hustling. Chris also earlier discussed being creative with designing rituals for ourselves. You know, we can even do low commitment, playful and connecting rituals with friends, such as a weekly morning chat, like I do with my friend Samara, called What's Good Wednesdays, where we share little nuggets of positivity and goofiness that bring affirmation to our heavy lives in the middle of a crazy week when we're losing our stuff. In more intimate, comprehensive environments, you know, you can also create other more like deep and like powerful and impactful ceremonies that are sharing with super close people that are supposed to represent either like large changes, making bonds with someone, you know, doing intentional settings of ceremonies with meditation, using crystals, using altars, doing a lot of other stuff that you can get creative, just like and with poetry, music, anything. So just real quick, if everyone has a phone or notepad, and you're willing to, I just want you to open up, if you have a phone, to your reminders. If you have a journal or something, I want you to pull it out if you would. If you have something to write with. I'll just give everyone a second to do that, whoever feels like participating. And I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to kind of play with what we've just been talking about here. So whenever people are ready, I'm just gonna take a minute to write some type of personal affirmation to yourself that you can have in your reminders that you set to come up on your phone every day at some time, so that you can see something, read it, speak it out loud, and be reminded that you are worthy, that you can fulfill and embody the gifts you came with, or whatever you need to remind yourself that life is worth living, worth growing, and worth doing. I'll just give everyone a couple more seconds. I'll be checking everyone's before they leave today, so better be good. So everyone, just if you can take as much time as you need, I'm going to just kind of keep moving through it. Yeah, I hope that helps. So why bother? Why focus on this framework with clients? You know, first we can look to the indigenous cultures and others who still are able to live in connection with nature. The Irish would practice the Bonus Rai to bring union to the divine masculine and feminine. The Tibetans utilize the 5 rites to bring relationship to their body and movement. Kenyan boys going through puberty do perform a rite of passage called crossing the line to mark the transition from boyhood to teenagehood. These and others lead to cultural preservation, which help maintain cultural traditions and heritage, passing them on to future generations. The emotional support can provide or emotional support during significant life events and helping individuals feel connected and supported by the community. Under personal growth, rituals and rites of passage often mark transitions in life, including personal reflection, growth and development, community bonding. Participating in rituals and ceremonies fosters a sense of unity and belonging within a community. Psychological comfort. Engaging in a familiar ritual can offer a sense of predictability and comfort, reducing stress and anxiety. And as we talk a lot about here, our mind and body are connected, and research indicates that individuals living in stressful environments are more prone to developing chronic conditions like heart disease, obesity, and diabetes. Exposure to environmental toxins such as air pollution or lead contamination can lead to various health problems, including respiratory issues, cognitive impairments, and developmental delays. Poor living conditions such as overcrowding, noise pollution, and lack of access to green spaces have been linked to increased risk of physical health issues. And so as I start to wrap up here, just wanted to share, I'm going to read this because it's probably hard to read for some people, but this comes also from the Tao Te Ching. To me, Taoism really embodies everything that we learn in our program in terms of, you know, not being rules, but guidelines to live in a naturalist philosophy that connects to the earth and community in full harmony, like a lot of indigenous cultures have throughout the years. And I think the wisdom in this book is for everyone, no matter what your beliefs are. And I really love this subject. I've written and utilized it in conversation to highlight the importance of having balance in your character and your action. You know, you can't be soft and squishy forever and allow life to plow over you. But you also can't be so hard that you can't have compassion, you can't hold space. And you need to be able to, as it discusses, as you're going through the river, you need to be able to bend around the rocks and not crash into it, trying to explode through it and break yourself in the process. Trustworthy words. Sorry, wrong page. Where did I just go? In all under heaven, nothing is softer and gentler than water, and yet it prevails over the hard and strong. It is invincible. Nothing prevails with such ease, gentle over strong, soft over hard. All under heaven knows the truth, and yet no one practices it. So the Taoist says, whoever is willing to accept the nation's filth will be the Lord of the earth altar. Whoever is willing to absorb the nation's misfortune will be king of all under heaven. Truths like these sound paradoxical. And lastly, contained within a circle, water is round. Within a square, it is square. When dammed, it is still. When unleashed, it moves. Water, softest of all things, wraps itself around mountains. It causes hills to move. It wears through iron and dissolves copper. Nothing prevails over water. Water extinguishes fire. Yin dissolves yang. The tongue is soft. The teeth are hard. The teeth are hard. The teeth perish before the tongue. Soft and gentle endure. All under heaven know this to be true, but is too ashamed of being humble. Is too attached to pride and power, and so refuses to practice it. So thank you for listening and appreciate you being here.
Well, beginning with a dance party and ending with soft and strong seems fitting. Thank you, Dan. We're going to get set up here and welcome our Zoom presenter, Nick Sharp, Relational Nature Therapy, Wholeness in Wildness.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you and congratulations to all of my classmates who have presented thus far today. I'm proud to be the caboose here, rounding up the group. I'd like to dedicate my capstone to everyone who has held a man through a hard time. Thank you. I believe that that gesture and love and compassion can help to change the world. When ready, please go ahead and play my presentation. Thank you all for joining.
So give us just a moment and we'll be right back. All right, Nick, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Make sure they're unmuted. Yeah. Okay,
Are you
well,
able to
we're
hear
going
me?
to move on to watch his video. It seems like unfortunately we weren't able to bring him on live, but thankfully he's put together a beautiful video for his presentation. So we'll go ahead and play.
continuously striving to meet our clients during the therapeutic process. It's our job to be on a journey with our clients' nervous systems. We do this by creating experiments. The first, and perhaps the most important experiment, is to slow down. That usually begins with breath. My thesis is that our identities change in relationship to the natural world through presence and contact over time. I was born an identical twin of Virginia, and it was that relationship that started in the outdoors when I became an Eagle Scout, but it really especially goes back long before that to the gentle creek behind my home that shaped me into the man I am today. At 21, I was a sea exploring mate for the Boy Scouts of America, leading 7 days on the open seas, snorkeling and fishing through the Florida Keys. I witnessed men who had never been to the open ocean before be transformed and become stewards of the ocean. This literally happened within a week. Years later, they would tell me stories from New Zealand working on a cow farm to hiking the Appalachian Trail, that the courage that they gained to step into the unknown came from that sail on the open ocean. I knew that with more tools and my own training, I could enhance these style voyages even further for long-term growth. I came to Naropa and challenged my own story, my defense mechanisms, and started to repair my own ship so that I could then guide others to do the same. I've completed an internship as a surf therapist and will be graduating this summer as a Gestalt equine psychotherapist through GEIR. Here's another peek into my story. When I moved to Colorado, I sought friends in the rocks and trees. Water was my home, yet I knew it was time to change the way I breathed. I was being called to the wild. The wilderness softly spoke. I was to explore the peaks of mountains and the valleys of my own heart. I was a stranger to feeling, and I didn't know how to slow. And then I began to listen. Finally, I started to pause in my own flow. Nature became my friend, and then I became my own friend too. The more time alive outside, the more I played in the dirt, the more I laid under the stars, the more present I become. In that presence, I found forgiveness, and then safety and trust too. I was learning to surrender by gazing into the mirror of nature. My work now is to empower others to gaze too into the wild. There is wholeness in wildness, wildness inside and wildness outside, wholeness for us all to find. My case study is on This Is Water. These are off-grid relational water-based experiences ranging from 4 days in the Channel Islands to 8 days in the Sea of Cortez. I began producing these experiences while in school. They are participant co-led with leaders coming from all backgrounds in wellness and skills. In the Guide to Aliveness, I will showcase what unfolds on these adventures. I will conclude with Return to Port, naming what I have learned and what is next on this great adventure. So we are water. Why water? Because our bodies are 60% water. Our brain is roughly 73% water. This earth that we're on right here in this very moment that's holding us, maybe beneath our feet, is 71% water. The human body, in its relationship to the natural world, can thrive when it reclaims that we are stepping into ourselves when we're joining once again with water. This Is Water, a water-based experience, is designed to reframe our personal narrative, uncover the ways that we protect ourselves, and hopefully put an end to self-isolation. The program is experienced in several different ways. We plan a voyage, we pack the vessel, we set course for a destination. We begin to understand the tides, and those, yes, we can usually predict. The exploration begins. But the weather is out of our hands at times. Our destination can sometimes change. Storms, they come and go. We learn to work on the vessel. We become familiar with the ship. We tidy, we organize, we repair, we understand the inner workings. We strengthen the whole. According to my pal, Jesse Carter, attachment is like the ocean. It's the foundation, and the relationship develops the ability to maintain course or contact through any rupture. or weather. Over time, this leads to intimacy with ourselves and others.
Change is happening, whether you're aware of change happening or not. Let's be the change. Let's open our hearts to change. There's a calling inside each one of us to become wild beings once again.
Saying yes to change is the indication that we're ready to be a part of change happening with us instead of change happening to us. So within this case study, I'll explain who's called to join these style experiences. They're typically folks that come from a background of suffering from anxiety or substance abuse or behavioral addiction, or have a tendency of avoidance or trouble self-regulating. They could also suffer from insecurities, challenges within groups, or have a lot of high stress. These experiences have also called in folks who are going through a transition or have lacked safety in their lives. Essentially, these experiences are made for anyone that is open to change.
What are you here to discover? We become what we discover. We were born in the waves, and we will return to the waves. The ocean, she spits, she speaks, and her tale is our story too. Return with us to the water. Let's uncover our secret truths. We do not journey into nature because we are nature. We journey into ourselves. We remember we are wildness too. Let's rally. Let's face fear on the horizon, giving thanks for the gift of tides. Adventure is our greatest ally. Change is the treasure we seek to find. This is a voyage home, my friends, under sweetness of stars and salt water. And instead of simply living, learning again how to be alive. This is water.
Our goal is to help people to feel alive once again by allowing them to be fully a part of their human experience. We find this most easily attainable when we're on the water.
Beyond being water, there is a ton of health benefits of actually being a part or near water as well. These are explored in Blue Mind Theory by Dr. Wallace J. Nichols. There is improved relaxation, creativity, enhanced mood, focus, and a little bit easier access to mindfulness. Scientifically, our serotonin, or the feel-good neurotransmitter, also, which plays a role in regulating mood, sleep, appetite, and stress levels, is released while we're on the water, as is dopamine, which is involved in the brain's reward system, which is associated with feelings of pleasure and motivation. Endorphins, which are natural painkillers produced in the body's response to stress or discomfort, are also released on the water, giving us a feeling of actually being landed when we're in relationship to the water. Oxytocin, which fosters a feeling of connectivity, also is released on the water, and cortisol levels have been shown to be decreased when we're in relationship with the water, creating a more calming and stressless environment that can actually make us feel more empowered when we're going through these often challenging experiences. It's really fundamental to look at Martin Buber's I-thou relationship perspective when we look at what happens at distance water. In the I-thou encounter, we relate to each other as authentic beings without judgment, qualification, or objectification. I meet you as you are, and you meet me as I am. In the I-thou relationship, which is who I am in my own heart and mind, I understand others for their heart and mind. It is the I encounter, which is the opposite, where we relate to it and other as an object, completely outside of ourselves. Oftentimes in these experiences, I like to ask folks not to use the word it, because it leaves it open to whatever you're talking about. We actually like to get really granular and define what it is. In the I, thou, we, this is the concept of me understanding that another is having a very different but also just as valid experience. By enabling this on these sails, we can once again navigate conflict and change with a little bit more ease. I have a photo here of a whale shark that one of these experiences that I had when I was swimming with the whale sharks in the Sea of Cortez, I realized, what am I doing here? This other great, majestic being is having this wonderful experience, and I'm separate, but I'm also a part of my own experience that is happening here as well. These experiences are totally different, which ultimately led me to getting out of the water and thanking the whale shark for allowing me to enter his sacred place of rest.
When we come together as community, we're able to change the story that we have to separate and isolate to go through a hard time. It's now more important than ever for us to be in groups and be in relationship so that we can go through a hard time and know that we can make it out okay when we have the support of other folks around us.
A lot of the work I do, and this is water and outside, all has to do with working in groups or partners. This is specifically important in the polyvagal theory proposed by Dr. Steve Porges, who describes how the vagus nerve, which is a key component in our autonomic nervous systems, influences our physiological and psychological responses to stress and social interactions. Theory suggests that the vagus nerve is a complex system that regulates our physiological and social engagement through the different interconnected branches, the dorsal vagal, our sympathetic, and our ventral vagal system. The sympathetic is for mobilization, which, think about this holistically, if we as a therapist, or if I as a therapist, I should say, am guiding someone through a tough or challenging time, if I stay rooted and then centered in my nervous system, I'm able to successfully co-regulate them through that hard time and bring them back so that they can relearn a story of the past, perhaps drawn up by some type of trauma, that they can go through that hard time and know that they can make it out okay. And we do this in a group of other people so that we once again learn that it's not necessary to separate and leave when we have to go through a really tough time. So all the framework of This is Water is done under the Gestalt therapy. Gestalt therapy is a holistic and experiential approach to psychotherapy that focuses on the present moment of the client's awareness through their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Gestalt means wholeness, and what we're trying to find is that in the human experience. It was founded in the 1940s by Fritz and Laura Perls with the support of Paul Goodman. What you'll see here on the left is the Gestalt cycle of change, which commonly happens with an action, and then we go through the cycle presenting various experiments to close unfinished business by maintaining regulation and contact with the client throughout the entire time. On the right, you'll see a photo of me leading up to one of the voyages that took place in the Channel Islands.
As soon as we say yes to ourselves, we're stepping into a new story. And it's in that vulnerability that we learn the tools and the skills and the resources to bring back to our daily lives. It's a gift to be here, to be available, and to be willing to experience life as it unfolds. I know from my own experience that I haven't always been here now. I spent a lot of time wondering or thinking instead of being. Now, this may resonate with somebody out there that also would just like to be once again.
For me, my own experience, being was really hard and really scary. I found support and safety because nature is a mirror. We see ourselves reflected in the world around us, whether we're not aware of that or not. Nature is constant. It's always going to be there, and it's always going to be able to hold us and help us feel rooted through these various experiences. This ship in this circumstance is the container. It's a closed container where human expression becomes amplified as if we're underneath a microscope. Somebody's behaviors back on land when we're on the boat will become noticeable to the other passengers, and we'll have to move through them and change those behaviors so we can start to shift to the telescope and view the outside lives so we can create synergy amongst the voyage. Also, water is so nurturing. The ocean serves as the constant, holding us throughout this experience, similar to us being held in utero during prenatal development. Now I'd like to speak a little bit about the guide to aliveness. So what actually happens on these voyages? Always we come back to breath. Every day has a mindfulness activity to start the day, some type of movement, whether it's yoga or Tai Chi, some type of creativity experiment, whether it's creating music or art, a land-based activity such as hiking, or water-based activities such as snorkeling or swimming or fishing. Here are two examples of activities from Friday and Saturday taken to a voyage that we did down out of La Paz, Mexico. Throughout these other experiences, We infuse various orienting and tracking skills, nature skills such as rewilding, that allow us to become more attuned to the natural world around us, such as creating fire or foraging for berries. There's also a lot of rite of passage that goes in this experience from start to finish. So we're really honoring the transition of beginning the voyage and ending the voyage as well. Power versus control. I like to take a moment and name these as Dewey Freeman states that control is the ability to influence another. Power is the ability to influence and be influenced by another. Power is the type of relationships that we want. It's the exchange, it's the harmonious giving and receiving, not control, which is one-sided and which is the basis of a lot of sexism, racism, all the isms that create destruction in our society, in our community, in our world. Trust is what happens the less we control. The more that we're in power-driven relationships, the more trust can exist.
When I put a boundary into place, what I'm really doing is giving someone a guidebook of how I want to be loved. Communication is the key. Language is so powerful, yet we learn at a very early age. Our vocabulary is strictly to give directions. It's when we're able to give our truth to others, that they're able to give their truth to us.
Before we sail, we make a living contract that everyone buys into. We go through conflict protocol so that we know when conflict arises, how to work with conflict so that we can all grow through the experience and know that someone is going to stay there through conflict and get out on the other end so that a tighter relationship can be built. We do this by having our values and our norms come together and create a unique culture at This Is Water. Once again, I'd like to take a moment to go back to the breath and show you an example of some of the breath work that happens on This Is Water. Yoga is an example of a way that we're able to drop back into our bodies. We spend so much time up here creating stories, creating narrative, that when we drop back into our bodies, we're able to become whole once again. The practice of yoga allows us to regulate breathing and realign our energetic structures.
When we wake up most mornings, we might always have the same routine. We might take that right turn. This is water. It's an invitation to take a left, to see what's at the end of the road or at the end of the sunset that we haven't seen yet before.
Tracking and orienting is so important so that we know no matter where we go, we can be here and present. We know the directions. We know what lays wherever it is that we're heading next. And some of the quotes by Boyd Vardy that have really empowered me on this experience in the Lion Tracker's Guide to Life are that no wild animal has participated in a should. Humans shouldn't either. And the art of the way the tracker sees something that he can look at 1,000 times and always see something new. We're going through these experiences, not noticing something that's so familiar to us, but something that may be familiar in a very different perspective. And of course, my favorite, which summarized that I don't know where it is that I'm going, but I know how to get there. That being said, I know how to get there when I have the tools to get anywhere. So how do we know that this will work given the vast differences in humans? Modeling communication is so important in these groups. If something is happening for one person, it is likely happening from another. By sharing, we're able to stop isolating and realize that other people can be going through what we're going through as well, and maybe put words or framework to something that we can't describe. We strive to have others feel seen, heard, validated, and protected when they're sharing their experiences and when we're going through experiences together. We do this in support of the natural world because it's with the natural world that we're truly able to land and feel safe in the present moment.
This is Water seizing the power of now. So it's within these explorations that we can step into the present moment, uncover wholeness in our lives, and say yes to the next great adventure that exists inside each and every one of us. We reclaim the wildness within our spirits to the wilderness of the landscape outside and become once again companions with the natural world.
When we're in power of relationships with the natural world, we can truly thrive. Everything from the water that we drink to the way that we carry ourselves, we have to become really, really attentive to starting to care for Earth again. Because it's in that exchange, not only does Earth become healthier, but we become healthier too. So we're returning to port, and what happens next? Community support via integration is the key. We hold each other accountable, and then they can hold us accountable too. It's within this community building that we're not put back on our own island, but we've created a new island where we're with others. We also can release technology for dependence of socializing. It's these tools that empower human resiliency over time to developmentally change the way that we feel in the world so we can become more secure. The world is okay, and I am okay in the world. This, of course, is all done through continued nervous system regulation. We're continuing to strengthen our nervous system through breathing and through various exercises so that we continue to go through a hard time, and on the other end, we know that we can land and be okay. I'd like to take a moment and explain what I've learned after completing roughly 3 different experiences with roughly 100 different individuals on This Is Water, as well as I've hosted 100 different folks on equine workshops, and I've had 100 clients at Waves of Recovery completed surf therapy. Bottom line, leadership is fundamental. You have to have solid leaders with their feet on the ground, not their head in the sky, that can really bring people back home. Second, the time to start is now. What is ever preventing you from beginning that next journey or that next voyage or that next idea, just do it. If you need support, please reach out to me. My information at the end of this slide, and I would love to help. Third, group size is fundamental, as is structure with softness, giving somebody to hold on to and creating an opening for them to step into and to feel secure that it's okay. Lastly, letting go of expectation. Expectation creates hesitation. When we release expectation, we can be fully alive and fully experience things as they unfold. And that, my friends, is quite beautiful.
This is water as a home. Ultimately, by creating a home within ourselves, a place where we feel safe to experience the world as it unfolds.
The future for This Is Water is to create more accessible options for various demographic groups. Basically, in the past, I've created these experiences on a sliding scale so that all different types of folks are able to attend. In the future, I'm going to continue to create day sales and retreats in Los Angeles, and also create corporate funding trips so that these voyages can allow folks from other backgrounds to also attend at a much lower cost. The biggest basis is I'm going to do my continued work with the natural world, continue my own regulation so that I can show up and continue to have an identity with the wildness around me. It is in that wildness that I truly believe that I can continue to find wholeness. I'd now like to open up my presentation to any questions, and know that regardless of when or where or how, I'm always here to be a resource to you or anyone else that needs a hand. Thank you so very much for tuning in today to my work on relational nature therapy, wholeness, and wildness. Begins with our primary caregivers.
So thank you, everyone. That was a beautiful video, Nick. And what wild adventures you have had this year. So it's been a long day. We've heard many amazing capstone presentations today. Actually, all of them really amazing. I'm going to let you make the meaning out of them. I don't need to tell you what it is. It's been a long day. So first things first, we're getting ready to close. We're on a tight timeline to close down the Nalanda Event Center. So, okay, first, we're going to invite all the presenters up on stage to take a bow together. And then afterwards, we need to stack the chairs in fours, 4 chairs in a stack. We can leave them in the middle. We'll need to put the cushions and that away and obviously help out with the food. So I'd like to welcome the class of 2024 up to the stage. So can we get someone to lead the bow? Who wants to lead the bow to close us out today?
To do the hands. Everybody hold hands. Rope bow or a real bow? Or not that new rope is not a real bow. Stage bow. Up.
Woo! Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming and celebrating with your graduates today.